Likutey Halakhot on Shulchan Aruch Yoreh Daya. Rebbe Noson, follower of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. Laws of Libated Wine. Law 1. Based on the lesson in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 19, discussed earlier in Laws of Ritual Slaughter. Wine must be very carefully guarded, even from the touch of the 70 nations, and is strictly forbidden immediately upon being touched by a member of the 70 nations. This is because wine corresponds to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, as mentioned in Laws of Meat, that has been left unwatched, as our sages said. Eve pressed grapes and gave Adam to drink, and is therefore midway between holiness, which corresponds to the holy tongue, and the languages of the 70 nations. For wine contains two aspects, good and evil. As our sages said, if one is deserving, one becomes a head, and if not, a tail. This corresponds to the tree of knowledge, which is sometimes good and sometimes otherwise, depending upon the state of holiness of the Jewish people. When they sanctify themselves and distance themselves from the evil of the 70 nations and subdue it, then the tree of knowledge is merged into good, and when otherwise, then the opposite. That is why wine must be carefully protected even from their touch, for they are very attached to it, and as soon as they touch it, it is transformed to their side and merged into them, becoming libated wine. This is because the typical wine is red wine, as our sages said, the redder, the better, as written. Do not look at wine that is red, which is why it is midway between the holy kingship, which corresponds to the holy tongue, for the kingship is the mouth, and the evil kingship, which is the languages of the 70 nations. The holy kingship corresponds to the kingship of David, who was red, with beautiful eyes and good looking, in contrast to a blemish in the covenant, which is a blemish in the eyes, which corresponds to the evil eye, corresponding to Balaam, in contrast to good-looking in holiness. Each one contrasts the other. Contrasting the holy kingship is the evil kingship, which is the kingship of Amalek that descended from Esau, who was called the Red One. As written, the first one emerged red, which corresponds to the defiled bloods, to a blemish in the covenant. That is why wine, which is red, is midway between the two kingships, which are both red. Wine must therefore be carefully guarded from their touch, for wine, which corresponds to the tree of knowledge and is midway between the kingships, is the fulcrum point of the scales. For the kingship is the lowest level of holiness, below which the disunity begins, as embodied in the 70 nations. As the Rebbe writes in the lesson, the wholeness of the holy tongue corresponds to the scales, as in, to make a scale for the spirit, for the speech of the holy tongue, which corresponds to the kingship, is the sight of the scales, which corresponds to free choice, and which is ultimately in the tree of knowledge, which can sway in either direction. Therefore, wine, which corresponds to the tree of knowledge, must be very carefully guarded even from their touch, for as soon as they touch it, it sways to their side and is disqualified. For when one side rises, the other side falls, as written, one nation will overcome the other. So when wine, which corresponds to intelligence, that is, if one is deserving, one becomes a head, is touched by them, it becomes David's fallen sukkah, as in an epileptic, which is caused by blood that overflows into and touches the brain, which causes David's fallen sukkah, as explained in the lesson in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 29. This, then, is the touching of the 70 nations, which corresponds to bad blood, to the blemishing of the covenant. So, when they touch the wine, which corresponds to the brain and the mind, it is damaged and falls, as in David's fallen sukkah. It can be inferred from the Rebbe's words there that the blemishing of wine corresponds to David's fallen sukkah, to the blemishing of David's kingship, which corresponds to red, as in red wine. That is why King David, who corresponds to the holy kingship, to the goblet of blessing, as written, I shall lift the goblet of salvation, therefore said, "A step between me and death," in 1 Samuel 23, and "My soul nearly fell into silence," for that is the fulcrum point of the scales. That is, David had to guard himself to a hair's breadth from the touch of the forces of evil, from the 70 nations, in order to sway the scales to the side of holiness. This is why the libated wine is called Nesech, which corresponds to kingship. As written, "I have been crowned from the beginning." So when wine is blemished by their touch, it becomes Nesech, corresponding to the evil kingship, and the opposite in holiness, as in, "Pour out a libation of wine to God." Numbers 28:7. Law 2. In the lesson in Likutey Moharan, Part 160, we find that through storytelling, we can arouse from sleep. There are people who sleep throughout their lifetimes, and there are those who have fallen asleep as a result of lust for eating or other things. For just as in the physical, there are foods that cause sleepiness or alertness, in the spiritual as well, there are foods that have not yet been sorted out that cause people to fall asleep, meaning a departing of intelligence and the mind, which correspond to the face that comes from the 70 faces of Torah. This type of sleep is the ultimate sleep, in that one loses one's face, which is intelligence, and the mind, which are the ultimate vitality, as in, wisdom sustains its owner, and one can lose all of the 70 faces, which corresponds to sleeping for 70 years. Study there in the lesson. But through storytelling, we can arouse from sleep. Some stories are considered within years, and other stories are from ancient times, which transcend all of the 70 faces of Torah, all of which receive from there. For the faces of Torah must be clothed in stories for 3 reasons. Study there. Section 1. This corresponds to the prohibition of libated wine. Wine that has been touched by a Gentile becomes immediately forbidden. Wine tends to bring on sleep, as we see empirically, so we must cautiously guard wine from being touched by a Gentile, for the touch of a Gentile immediately imbues the wine with the power of sleep, which is the departing of the 70 faces of the Holy Torah. This is because the Gentiles correspond to the darkened faces, which the shining faces, the latter being the 70 faces of the Torah, while the Gentiles, who are the 70 nations, correspond to the 70 darkened faces that are the opposite of the 70 faces of Torah, as explained elsewhere. And since wine tends to bring on sleep, and sleep, which corresponds to the departing of the 70 faces, has a foothold on it. Therefore, as soon as a Gentile who embodies sleep, the realm of evil, the departing of the 70 faces of Torah, Halakhah, for the Gentiles are the 70 nations that counter the 70 faces of Torah, touches the wine comes under the power of sleep, corresponding to the departing of the 70 faces of Torah, Halakhah, which is why it is forbidden to us. This is why such wine is called Nesech, corresponding to sleep, as in, God poured over you a spirit of slumber and has sealed your eyes. For the touch of a Gentile makes the wine Nesech, which corresponds to sleep, to the departing of the 70 faces, which is the totality of holiness. The word for wine is numerically 70, as our sages said. Wine is numerically 70, and the word for secret is numerically 70. When wine enters, secrets come out. Thus, in holiness, wine embodies all of the 70 faces, whereas as soon as it is touched by a Gentile, who corresponds to the sleep of the realm of evil, the 70 faces depart from it, and it becomes an embodiment of sleep, which corresponds to Nesech. Section 2. That is why the prohibition is specifically related to touch, for touch is with the hands, which are the vehicles of action, which tend to bring on sleep, which is related to action, since sleep corresponds to the departing of the mind, when the body, which is materiality, which corresponds to action, remains alone. Our sages thus said, 10 measures of sleep descended into the world, 9 were taken by slaves, for sleep corresponds to action and servitude. This is why storytelling arouses from sleep. In the discussions after the Rebbe delivered this awesome lesson, he said, "I have now said 3 things that contrast conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom says that storytelling induces sleep, but I say the opposite, that storytelling arouses from sleep." He then mentioned another 2 things spoken about in the lesson that contrast conventional wisdom. All of his talks are indeed extremely deep. They are all Torah containing very deep secrets even on the simple level, and any individual at their level is able to find in them limitlessly great depth and expansive insight. So indeed, specifically because common stories induce sleep, are the authentic tzaddikim able to arouse from sleep through storytelling. For judgment can only be ameliorated at its root. For whoever is attached to materiality, which corresponds to action, the storytelling will bring on sleep, since the story is of something that has happened, which corresponds to action, which draws the person toward action, which induces sleep, which is the result of action and materiality. The tzaddik, though, is the opposite, for he arouses from sleep specifically through storytelling, since through his story he elevates, binds, and arouses the story, which corresponds to action, to the telling, elevating action to speech, which corresponds to intelligence and mind, for speech comes from intelligence. As written, "From his mouth are intelligence and understanding." Thus, since he arouses from sleep specifically through storytelling, for judgment can only be ameliorated at its root. Therefore, specifically, through his telling of stories, does he elevate and ameliorate action, which corresponds to sleep, through which he arouses from sleep. This corresponds to wine having 2 aspects, sleep and arousal from sleep. Wine naturally tends to bring on sleep, both physically and spiritually, as we see empirically, and as written, "When one sets one's eye upon the chalice, one proceeds straight ahead, for all things then seem possible to a person," which corresponds to sleep, to the departing of all the 70 faces of the Torah. For intoxication causes one to fall from all the 70 faces of the Torah until all things seem possible to a person, which is an inherent feature of sleep, which is true of intoxicating wine as well. But there is also gladdening wine, as in wine gladdens the heart, which corresponds to a joyful heart benefits the face, meaning that through drinking wine with holiness, one attains a face of holiness, which corresponds to intelligence and mind, as in, "Wine and fragrance make wise." This corresponds to, "You palate is like the best wine, causing the lips of the sleeping to speak," which corresponds to arousal from sleep, which corresponds to speech, as in opening the mouth of the mute, as explained in the lesson. This is our sage's teaching. Why is wine called the arouser? If one is deserving, one becomes a head, and if one is not deserving, one becomes a pauper. The head corresponds to arousal from sleep, which corresponds to the head and the mind. But if one is not deserving, one becomes a pauper, which corresponds to a deepening of sleep through the wine, as in, "Do not love sleep, lest you become impoverished." That is also why song is only song over wine, for song corresponds to an arousal from sleep, as in, "Awaken, sing a song." For judgment is only ameliorated at its root. Thus, specifically through wine, which contains both sleep and arousal from sleep, specifically through it can we arouse from sleep, for when we are able to elevate wine to its root in holiness, sleep is then ameliorated, and then through the wine, one is able to arouse from sleep. Section 3. This corresponds to reciting the Kiddush specifically over wine. Shabbat corresponds to arousal from sleep, since the 6 workdays correspond to sleep, since the 6 days of creation correspond to work, servitude, corresponding to materiality, which corresponds to sleep. For slaves took 9 portions of sleep, as said. But the holy Shabbat corresponds to arousal from sleep, For Shabbat corresponds to intelligence and mind, since the 6 workdays, during which we do all of our work, correspond to foolishness, to sleep, to the departing of the mind, as in, the people roamed about and gathered the manna with foolishness. But Shabbat is rest, in contrast to servitude, and corresponds to arousal from sleep to intelligence, as written regarding Shabbat, to know that I, God, sanctify you. That is why at the onset of Shabbat we declare, "Awaken, awaken, 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 sing a song." For it is a time of arousal from sleep, since all of the 70 faces of Torah shine on Shabbat, for the Torah was given on Shabbat. That is why we attain an illumination of the countenance on Shabbat, as our sages said on the verse, "God blessed the 7th day. He blessed it with a bright countenance." For a person's face during the week does not resemble his face on Shabbat, for Shabbat corresponds to an illumination of the countenance, which corresponds to an arousal from sleep, as said. This is what we recite at the onset of Shabbat. Her face was brilliant with supernal lights, which corresponds to an illumination of the countenance. Thus, at the onset of Shabbat, we recite the Kiddush specifically over wine and declare over it, "God completed," which corresponds to an arousal from sleep through storytelling. On Shabbat, we must tell over a chalice of wine the story of creation, that God created the entire creation during the 6 workdays and rested on Shabbat, through which we elevate and bind the entire creation of the 6 workdays to Shabbat, which is the mind and vitality of all creation. That is the ultimate arousal from sleep, for all the work done in creation corresponds to sleep. But when we draw into it intelligence and vitality, which correspond to Shabbat, which is the rest from the work, the entire creation is thereby aroused and ascends on high, for materiality and work are transformed and dissolved into spirituality, which corresponds to the vitality and mind that comes upon it. This corresponds to the ascent of the worlds on Shabbat. All worlds are aroused and ascend on high through arousal from sleep, which corresponds to intelligence and the mind, which is the vitality through which the ascent of all things takes place, as explained in the lesson. Thus, at the onset of Shabbat, we must specifically tell this story in the Kiddush over a chalice of wine. For through telling the story of creation on Shabbat, by proclaiming over a chalice of wine, God completed, telling that God did His work during the 6 workdays and rested on the 7th day. Through that, we elevate and arouse the entire creation from sleep and work, elevating it and binding it to intelligence, which is the vitality, which corresponds to telling a story. For speech, which comes from intelligence, is the root of the vitality of all creation. As written, the heavens were made with God's word. So specifically, through telling stories, which corresponds to Kiddush on Shabbat, is arousal from sleep brought about. In other words, we elevate the story, which corresponds to work and doing, and bind it to its root, which is speech and intelligence, all of which takes place on Shabbat through Kiddush over wine, as said. Hence, the Kiddush corresponds to arousal from sleep through telling stories. That is why we must recite the Kiddush over wine, for specifically, through wine we elevate the 6 days of work and doing, and arouse them from work and doing and sleep to an arousal from sleep, for wine contains both aspects, and judgment is ameliorated only at its root. Thus, specifically through wine, we ameliorate the work and doing and sleep, and elevate and arouse the entire work and doing of creation, from sleep to arousal from sleep. That is why sleep on Shabbat is a delight, for sleep on Shabbat is actually an arousal from sleep, ameliorating the judgment at its root, as in arousal from sleep, specifically through telling stories and doing, as said. Section 4. This corresponds to the chalice of wine used for reciting the grace after meals. Food sometimes brings on sleep, as mentioned in the lesson, so we must recite the grace after meals. since it corresponds to arousal from sleep. For by blessing God who created our food and proclaiming that God created everything, we thereby arouse the vitality that is in the food, which corresponds to arousal from sleep. For the essence of sleep is a departing of the vitality. But when we bless God and proclaim that He created this food, we arouse the vitality that is in it, which corresponds to arousal from sleep. That is why we must recite the grace after meals specifically over a chalice of wine, for arousal from sleep is specifically through a blessing over wine, since judgment is ameliorated only at its root. This is, the chalice of the grace after meals is counted for the good, but not for harm. For though wine contains both aspects and can bring upon sleep, the chalice of the grace after meals is only counted for the good, for arousal from sleep, and not for harm, corresponding to sleep, to the departing of intelligence. But, for by reciting blessings over the chalice of wine, the wine is thereby merged into holiness, and then specifically, through it, is an arousal from sleep brought about. Section 5. This is why we must guard wine from the touch of a Gentile, specifically from touch. Touch corresponds to action and doing, so the touch of a Gentile who corresponds to the 70 darkened faces, in contrast to the 70 faces of the Torah, their touching the wine brings it into the realm of action and doing, which corresponds to sleep, which is the departing of the 70 faces, as said. Section 6. This corresponds to having to set one's eyes on the chalice of wine for the grace after meals, specifically the eyes, which correspond to the Yayin, numerically 70, faces of the Torah that are embodied in the chalice of wine for the grace after meals, which corresponds to arousal from sleep. Section 7. This is why our sages said, a wide step takes away the light of one's eyes, but it can be retrieved through the Kiddush on the eve of Shabbat. For through Kiddush over wine we evoke the Yayin, the 70 faces, as said, through which the light of the eyes is repaired. And this is why there are 70 words in the Kiddush, which corresponds to the 70 faces of Torah that are evoked by the Kiddush, which correspond to an arousal from sleep. Section 8. In the first of the Rebbe's stories about the lost princess, is told that wine brings on sleep. Because the viceroy did not refrain from drinking wine as the princess had warned him, he fell into deep sleep for 70 years. Study there well. Falling asleep for 70 years means that one falls from all of the 70 faces of the Torah, which correspond to 70 years, as explained well in the lesson. This story is in fact related to this lesson, for they were both told around the same time, as we understood that the lesson was related to the story. And if you have intelligent eyes, open them to see, and set your heart to understand this lesson and this story, and you will see amazing things, how they are intertwined. With allusions and insight into the story from the lesson, you will see a bit of this if you are able to set your heart well on this, but its entirety you will see only in the future, if you are deserving. Law 3. Regarding wine that becomes forbidden by being touched by a Gentile, which is unique law, for nothing else becomes forbidden to eat and benefit from simply by being touched by a Gentile. Based on the lesson in Likutey Halakhot, Part 2, 26. It is explained there that we must avoid intoxication, whereas a bit of drinking is good to expand one's intelligence, since intelligence is embodied in loving kindness. So, when one drinks in proper measure, one's intelligence is thereby expanded and elevated, and the loving kindness is greatly enhanced. But if one drinks too much and becomes intoxicated, then, on the contrary, the harsh judgments are empowered, which causes anger and rage. And sometimes the empowered judgments of the realm of evil are able to cause harm. Furthermore, intoxication causes one to forget all of the commandments and warnings that Moses instructed, for Moses is embodied in every single limb of every single Jewish person, reminding every single limb to perform the commandment related to that limb. For the 248 positive commandments parallel the 248 limbs. That is why Moses is called the lawmaker, which is numerically 248, for he reminds us of the 248 commandments, whereas intoxication causes us to forget them, as in, lest he drink and forgets the law. And the embodiment of Moses in the limbs is itself the embodiment of intelligence in loving kindness. For Moses is himself the intelligence, and the limbs are 248, which corresponds to Abraham, man of loving kindness, whose name is numerically 248. Section 1. This corresponds to the prohibition of generic Gentile wine, which is wine touched by a Gentile. Holy wine is very exalted, for it gladdens God and men. As our sages said, if it gladdens man, how does is gladden God? From here, we learn that the Levitic song that accompanied sacrificial offerings in the temple was only during the wine libation service. But wine requires very great protection from the blemish of the clutch of a Gentile. For the Jewish people are bound to the right, while the Gentiles are bound to the left. The Jewish people are bound to the right, which corresponds to loving kindness, to Abraham, man of loving kindness, to the 248 positive commandments, and completely distant from sins that are caused by bad bloods that are bound to the 365 blood vessels, as the Rebbe writes elsewhere, that at their root, the Jewish people are completely distant from sins. The Gentiles, though, are bound to the left, which corresponds to the blood in the left ventricle of the heart, which corresponds to the evil that is attached to the 365 blood vessels, from which arise all sins committed by anyone transgressing any of the 365 negative commandments. That is from where the Gentiles derive their power, for they are from the realm of Esau, who is Edom, who was the red one, called such after the intense evil blood of the 365 blood vessels, from where he draws his power, as well as do all the Gentiles who are contained in him. That is why the Jewish people are in fact completely distant from sin, and why all Jewish sins come only from the attachment of the Gentiles, as in, they intermixed with the nations and learned from their ways. This is because the Jewish people are bound to the right, to the 248 positive commandments which are on the right, for Moses, who is the intelligence that is embodied in every limb of every Jewish person, reminds each limb of the mitzvah related to it, which is the ultimate source of Jewish vitality. Since the ultimate vitality comes from intelligence, as in, wisdom enlivens its owner. On the other hand, the Jewish people are ultimately distant from sins, for sins are not inherent to them at all, and they should thus only do the commandments and never sin. However, though Moses is embodied in every limb, reminding and warning them all to do the mitzvah related to it, nevertheless, the human being must always be left with free choice, for the essence of creation was so that the human being would have free choice. In other words, when an individual seeks to bring from potential to actualization to do some mitzvah or other holy act, as Moses is constantly urging, then immediately upon this urge to do a mitzvah and to bring from potential to actualization, obstacles and interferences coming from the bad bloods of the 365 blood vessels, the source of Gentile power, are aroused. For it is impossible to do anything and to bring from potential to actualization without thought, speech, and action. Now regarding thought, all Jewish people certainly desire to fulfill all the commandments of the Torah, for Moses is embodied in them, as said. But when they go to actually do some holy act, this inevitably must go through speech before reaching the stage of action. For all things must pass through thought, speech, and action before coming to actualization, as explained elsewhere. But when coming into the stage of speech, and speech comes from the judgments, as the Rebbe writes, as in, they will tell of your might, and my heart is hot inside me when I speak. A fire blazes, when I talk with my tongue. The 70 nations attached to the evil in the blood, in the 365 limbs, are aroused and rise up to malign that person and prevent them from doing that holy act. And not only do they seek to prevent that person from doing any of the commandments or holy acts, but also seek to entice them to sin through the intensification of the bad bloods, from which arise the inclination for evil and the lusts. That is the ultimate root of the power of free choice and of the test of every individual who must overcome this evil of the bad bloods that correspond to the 70 nations. But not only must one subdue and eliminate this evil in the blood and do the commandments and holy acts, and certainly not act out one's lusts or commit any sins, but one must also overcome the bloods themselves and transform them to the very opposite, transform all the passion and boiling of the blood into holiness. In other words, one should do that mitzvah or that holy act with an impassioned heart and with great holy enthusiasm that comes from the blood of the 365 limbs that one has been able to subdue and transform into holiness. That is the ultimate wholeness of a mitzvah and service. For doing a mitzvah without any aliveness and heart passion is not a complete service, since this is just like doing it only out of habit. The wholeness of service is to make the effort to do all the commandments with passion and an enthused heart, which is achieved specifically by overcoming obstacles, by overcoming the many obstacles that arise from the surge of the bad bloods and transforming them into holiness, such that one then does the mitzvah with great joy and passion. This corresponds to, "You shall love your God with all your heart," spelled with 2 letters, with your 2 inclinations, the inclination for good and the inclination for evil. For the ultimate wholeness of service is to transform the inclination for evil, which corresponds to the boiling of the blood, into holiness, into holy love, as in, "You shall love your God with your 2 inclinations." For when one transforms the boiling of the bloods into holiness, so that one's heart burns with flames of love for God, the left is thus merged into the right. The judgments are thus merged into loving kindness, into love. For the ultimate wholeness of service is when one is able to love God and to do the commandments, which correspond to love and loving kindness with both inclinations, as in, "You shall love," with 2 inclinations. For then the love is with great passion, like flames of love, and then the left is merged into the right, which is the ultimate wholeness. This is as in, "For love is as brazen as death, jealousy as harsh as the grave. Its flames are flames of fire, flames of God," meaning that the love for God should be like flames of fire, which comes from the boiling of the blood that has been transformed into holiness, which is when one loves God with the inclination for evil as well. This is, love is as brazen as death. For the ultimate wholeness of love is through the inclination for evil, which is the realm of death, when it has been transformed into holiness. As the Rebbe writes about, the great benefit there is that a person has an inclination for evil. Section 2. These 2 stages correspond to Moses and David. Moses corresponds to the urging and reminding to each and every Jewish person, to each and every limb, to do the commandments, as said. But when one then goes to act upon that urging of Moses, the obstacles and impediments arise against the individual from the bad bloods, which correspond to the 70 nations, as said, which one must then rise up to struggle against by waging God's battle to conquer and break them, in order to bring that holy act from potential to actualization and to transform the evil into good, to transform the heat of the blood into the passionate heart of holiness. This battle and this effort corresponds to David, who constantly fought God's battles and subdued the 70 nations, incinerating the evil bloods and transforming the heat of the bloods into holiness. For David was called a red one with beautiful eyes in 1 Samuel 16:12, for he was red in holiness, in contrast to Esau, who was red with evil. For David's entire life was to fight God's battles, to kill and destroy the 70 nations, and transform the blood into holiness, so that he would be able to serve God with a whole heart. David corresponds to the heart, for David corresponds to speech, since he embodied the malchut mouth, whereas Moses corresponds to intelligence, and respectively they correspond to these two stages, as said. The urging and reminding is dependent upon thought, which corresponds to intelligence that reminds every individual through their intelligence and thought that is spread throughout all the limbs to do the commandments. But when one then wants to enact it, this must pass through the stage of speech, which comes from judgments, from blood, in which the battle takes place. And the victory in this battle comes through David, who corresponds to speech. But in fact, the two are one. Moses and David are contained in each other. Moses contains David, and David contains Moses, and one cannot be without the other, for it is impossible to complete any mitzvah or holy act without both of them. However, though each level is comprised of all levels, nevertheless, each level has a specific aspect by itself, as can be understood from the Kabbalistic writings in various places. This corresponds to the written Torah and the oral Torah, to Torah and prayer. Moses corresponds to the written Torah, which is only reminding and urging, for the written Torah does not explain any law of any commandment, so we cannot know from it how to fulfill any commandment. Thus, it is only a reminder and an urging, for the written Torah, corresponding to Moses, reminds and urges the person to do all of the commandments, reminding us, for instance, to lay tefillin, to do tzitzit, or to build a sukkah, but we still do not know from what materials to make the tefillin. That is why, when we want to actually act and do a mitzvah, we cannot do it without the oral Torah that Moses transmitted to us orally, in which are explained the laws of every single commandment. The oral Torah corresponds to speech, to King David, to malchut mouth, and it is impossible to fulfill any mitzvah without it passing through the stage of speech. That is why all laws of the commandments are explained only in the oral Torah, for it is impossible to fulfill a commandment stated in the written Torah without knowing the laws of that mitzvah as transmitted to us orally. Hence, the written Torah corresponds to a reminder, and the oral Torah leads to action, which is why it is oral, for it is impossible to reach action without going through speech, which corresponds to King David. This corresponds to Torah and prayer. The totality of the Torah corresponds to thought and intelligence, to Moses, which corresponds to the written Torah, and prayer corresponds to bringing to action, to speech, to the oral Torah. Overcoming the inclination for evil and the bad bloods, and standing up against all the obstacles until one is able to act, is achieved through prayer, as can be understood from the Rebbe's words in several places. For the main power to attain anything holy is through prayer, which corresponds to David, as in, I am prayer. This corresponds to the book of Psalms that David composed of 5 books, paralleling the 5 books of Moses. David's entire effort and toil in waging God's battles and composing many prayers written into the book of Psalms was to bring all of the commandments into action, that we will be able to fulfill the Torah that Moses instructed and urged us to do, as can be understood from Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 31, that the formation of the letters of the Torah for the good is accomplished through prayer, which is by expressing one's yearning with the mouth. Study there. Section 3. As known, King David corresponds to the chalice of wine used for a blessing, as in, I lift the chalice of salvation, Psalms 109:13, and my chalice overflows, there, 23:5. And our sages said that David will declare in the future that he is the most fitting to lead the blessings of the grace after meals, Pesachim 119b. This is because wine corresponds to the heat of the blood, as we see empirically how wine and other intoxicating beverages warm the blood, and as our sages said on the verse, do not look at wine that it is red, Proverbs 23:31, that will end up as blood, Sanhedrin 70a. Wine thus contains 2 aspects, as our sages said. If one is deserving, it gladdens. If not, it empties the mind. there, for whoever is able to drink wine with holiness from the chalice of blessing on Shabbat and festivals, that wine is a great benefit, for through the wine will the heart become enthused with flames of love for God. Since wine elevates the mind and gladdens the heart to sense in one's intelligence the realization of yearning and cleaving to God, which is the ultimate intelligence, the heart becomes warmed and impassioned with great enthusiasm and joy to merge into God and to cleave to Him, which is the ultimate wholeness of love, when the heat of the blood, which corresponds to wine, is transformed into holiness, to become enthused with flames of love for God. This is, we delight and rejoice in you. We recall your love more than wine. Song of Songs 1:4, which is the ultimate wholeness of love. This corresponds to wine that gladdens God and men. Judges 9:13, as in, wine gladdens the human heart. Psalms 104:15. For the ultimate joy is to sense in the heart a knowing of God, which is the source of all joys in the world, as in, serve God with joy. Know that Hashem is God. There, 102. This is because the ultimate joy is when we know that He is God, as in, I will rejoice in God. There, 104:34, and I will rejoice in Him. There, 33:21, and I will rejoice in God. My soul will delight in my God. Isaiah 61:10. And as for me, I will rejoice and delight in the God of my salvation. Habakkuk 3:18. For the ultimate joy is when we know of God, which is the ultimate goal and good of all good. That is why holy wine, which elevates the intelligence, as our sages said, if one is deserving, one becomes a head, Yoma 77b, and the ultimate intelligence is knowing God gladdens the heart, for that is the ultimate joy. That is why the Levitic song that accompanied sacrificial offerings in the temple was only during the wine libation service, for the ultimate bonding to God is through prayer and song and praise, which correspond to King David, who was the sweet singer of Israel, which corresponds to wine that gladdens. Now, the joy that is attained through holy wine is attained through the above, by transforming the heat of the blood, which is the source of the power of the 70 nations, into holiness, fulfilling the commandments with flames of love, specifically through the heat of the blood, which is the essence of wine that gladdens, for wine corresponds to the heat of the blood. Thus, when it is merged into holiness, that is the ultimate wholeness of holy love, which is the ultimate source of joy, for the essence of joy is when the left is merged into the right, which corresponds to the above. The ultimate joy comes through David's lyre, which corresponds to the 10 types of melody, which are the source of joy, as written, upon a 10-stringed instrument. For you have gladdened me, O God, with your works. Psalms 92:4, and David's lyre, the source of joy, was played specifically by the northern wind that blew through it, Brachot 3b, and the north is the left. And specifically from there comes the ultimate melody and joy. That is because the essence of melody and joy is when the good spirit is sorted out from the evil spirit, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 54, which is when the inclination for evil, which corresponds to the bloods, are transformed into holiness by doing the commandments with holy passion and great enthusiasm and aliveness, which is the ultimate joy. This is the meaning of what is stated in the Tikkun Zohar. Song comes from the left, paragraph 3a. Section 4. That is why we must guard wine very meticulously from the touch of a Gentile. Even kosher wine demands very great caution not to drink it outside of a holy meal, for if one is not deserving, it empties the mind. But even in a holy meal, one must be cautious not to drink too much, so that one will not become intoxicated, so that the judgments will not be intensified, leading one to completely forget Moses' urgings. It can also lead one to all sins. As our sages said, when one sets one's eye upon the chalice, one proceeds straight ahead. Proverbs 23:31. Yoma 74b. For all sins are caused by the heat of the blood in the 365 blood vessels that is intensified by the intoxicating wine, as explained in the lesson. But most of all, we must not drink wine that has been touched by a Gentile, for as soon as a Gentile touches the wine, it is seized by the 70 nations that correspond to the evil in the blood, corresponding to Esau the red one, which corresponds to the blemishing of wine, as in, do not look at wine that it is red, Proverbs 23:31, that will end up as blood, Sanhedrin 70a. That is the source of all sins in the Torah, for wine is numerically 70, and in holiness, one attains intelligence through the wine, which corresponds to the 70 faces of the Torah, as in, give a lot of wine to the children so that they will talk, Sanhedrin 38a. For when wine enters, secrets come out, but when one drinks without holiness, and all the more when one drinks wine that has been touched by a Gentile, the evil of the 70 nations is absorbed into it. The evil of all their wickedness that corresponds to the boiling of the blood, which corresponds to wine that heats the blood, becomes attached to this person, on account of which one forgets all of Moses' urgings and can come to sin. This corresponds to, for a chalice is in God's hand, filled with strong wine to be poured out, but all the wicked of the earth will drink its dregs. Psalms 75:9. For the blemish of all the wicked corresponds to the dregs of wine, to blemished wine, to the blemish of boiling blood. This corresponds to the chalice of poison mentioned regarding the punishment of all the Gentiles and the wicked, Isaiah 51:17. For all their wickedness, as well as all their punishment, comes from blemished wine, while in holiness, reward is called wine. As our sages said, the righteous will attain the wine stored in its grapes since the 6 days of creation. Brachot 34b. For as said earlier, this corresponds to, I lift the chalice of salvations. 2. My chalice is overflowing. 2. God is my portion, my lot, my chalice. Psalms 16:5, which corresponds to the chalice of wine used for a blessing that is held in the right hand. Brachot 51a. For the left becomes merged into the right, which is the source of song, melody, and joy. Section 5. This corresponds to printing. God, in His compassion, has introduced the skill of printing in these end of days, so that holy books will proliferate in the world. As our sages said, written things you may not say orally, and oral things you may not write down. Gittin 60b. And we have already explained that the written and oral Torahs correspond to Moses and David, to Torah and prayer, which correspond to thought and speech, which respectively correspond to the reminders and urgings of Moses on the one hand, and the endeavor to win the battle, which corresponds to David, on the other. But these two need each other and cannot exist without each other. Thus, the written and the oral Torahs are both necessary, and the ultimate wholeness of the Torah is specifically through both of them, and neither can exist without the other. As written, God's laws are true, upright together. Psalms 19:10. The written Torah lacks wholeness without the oral Torah, for we cannot know any law or how to do any mitzvah without the oral Torah. And the oral Torah also lacks wholeness without the written Torah, because the entire oral Torah is based upon the written Torah, since it is a commentary on the written Torah, for there is nothing that is not alluded to in the Torah. Now, the essence of the written Torah corresponds to reminding, as written. Inscribe this as a reminder in the book, Exodus 17:14, which corresponds to Moses' urgings, which corresponds to the reminders that he warns every limb of the commandments related to it. That is why it is in writing, for the essence of memory is in writing, since oral things can be completely forgotten. So we must specifically write them down, so that the words will endure specifically through the writing. That is why written things must not be said orally, for urging and memory are through writing. Oral things, though, must be relayed specifically orally and must not be committed to writing. For the oral Torah, which corresponds to bringing to action, which is impossible without oral speech. For through holy speech, we transform the judgments into loving kindness, which is the ultimate victory in the battle. That is why they must be relayed specifically orally and must not be written down, for writing is only for memory, but it is difficult to act upon the written word. For it is impossible to express in writing all the details of the commandments and all the ways and methods there are in the service of God. That is because the inclination for evil and its armies that are attached to the putridness of the bloods are very potent in every individual, confusing them greatly to overturn the truth. That is why it is impossible to explain everything in writing. For things written in a book can be distorted from the truth and misinterpreted however the reader wishes. As we see, many have turned the words of the living God on their heads and interpreted the written Torah in foreign ways that contradict the words of our sages, that have led to great denials of faith based upon their foreign interpretations. For in writing, it is impossible to explain the truth completely, since each individual is able to interpret the written word however they wish. That is why God gave us all the laws of the Torah and its interpretations orally, for orally it is possible to explain and expound the authentic truth well, all the laws of the Torah, its ways and its strategies. But orally alone, without the written, is also not wholeness, for the oral has no foundation or commemoration, and over time, it could become completely forgotten. That is why both are needed, the written and the oral, for in writing it is possible to protect the urging and the commemoration, for written things endure forever, whereas the oral is necessary to explain the authentic truth of the laws and ways of the Torah, which is only possible to explain specifically by word of mouth. Over time, though, as the exile intensified and our sages were concerned that the oral Torah would be forgotten, they therefore permitted to write down the oral Torah as well, because a time to act for God, they have annulled your Torah. Psalms 119, 126, Torah 14b. They realized that the concern of its being forgotten is more serious than the concern that it will be misinterpreted in writing, so they permitted to write down the oral Torah. However, when writing down the oral Torah, it is necessary to expound very greatly in order to explain the authentic truth very clearly, for things written in a book can be misinterpreted. So commentaries and explanations and commentaries upon the commentaries are required, so that no one will err from the authentic meaning and intention of the text. As we see, from the day that they began writing down the oral Torah, its books have multiplied exponentially in the world, for it could not be otherwise. Especially since the hearts and minds are constantly getting weaker, as our sages said, Eruvin 53a, and as explained throughout the literature. So, new books are constantly needed to explain well the intention of our sages. For instance, Rabbi Isaac Alfasi summarized the Talmudic laws in his holy books, but then many books came to explain and interpret his words, or to dispute them when others thought otherwise. And then books were composed, surrounding the interpreters of the Alfasi's interpreters, and so on, all of which are greatly needed in the world, for without them we would not know any law today. The same is true regarding the ways of moral behavior, fear of God, and strategies and methods in the service of God. Holy books are constantly coming out, all in order to explain to us, well, the authentic paths and strategies to attain the proper service of God. And the longer that the exile stretches on, due to our many sins, and the hearts become ever weakened, many more books are needed to explain the authentic intention well in order to break the teeth of the evildoers, to uproot from the hearts of errants and deniers, so that they will be unable to overturn and mislead from the truth. Thus, over time, when God saw that the exile is intensifying even more and the hearts are weakening even more greatly, and many more books are needed, in His compassion for His people, He arranged in His amazing wonders for the skill of printing to be invented in the world, so that the proliferation of books could increase exponentially. For the amount of books coming out in these generations would have been completely impossible to write manually. And indeed, we need them all, for we could certainly not know the laws of the Torah clearly without having the Talmud with Rashi, Tosafot, Maharsha, and the other commentaries, and the Opus of the Alfasi with all of its commentaries, the works of Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, the Rosh, and the Maimonides with all of their commentaries, the Tur and its commentaries, the Beit Yosef and the Rama and their commentaries, and all the responsa literature, all of which are used by the leading authorities in their books when they seek to clarify a law properly. Without all of which and more, it would be impossible to clarify any law properly. The same with the ways of strategy and ethical behavior in the service of God. We need all the books of the Midrash and their commentaries, the volumes of the Holy Zohar and the writings of the Ari, the Reshit Chochmah, and so forth. So indeed, how great is God's kindness in having compassion on us and providing us with the printing press, through which the books can proliferate and be bought very cheaply, such that every single individual in every town has many books through which the Torah endures amidst the Jewish people today. For when we write down the oral Torah, we must write prolifically in order to properly explain the truth. And in every generation in which the hearts are weakening ever more must be explained, and more holy books are needed, as the Rebbe writes that there are today many books, but there will yet be many more, and they are all very needed in the world, and none of them should be mocked. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 161. The verse thus says, "More than this, be cautious, my son, from composing many countless books." Ecclesiastes 12:12, upon which Rashi explains, "More than what is written, be cautious to fulfill the oral teachings of the sages." 12. Why then were they not committed to writing? Composing many countless books, if we would try to write them down, we would be unable. This is, as said, if we seek to write down oral teachings, very much will need to be written. So the existence of the printing press is a great boon, for with it we are able to print very many books, through which the Torah will not be forgotten by the Jewish people. Section 6. That is why Jacob prophesied when he blessed Judah to be the forebearer of the Messiah. A staff will never leave Judah, and a scribe from between his legs, until the coming of Shiloh. Genesis 49:10. Scribe corresponds to the printing press. Jacob was thus prophesying that the staff, as in the staff of the scribe, Judges 5:14, corresponding to the composing of the holy books of the Torah, will never leave Judah, and that the scribe, the printing press that will be invented in the world, will never cease printing Jewish books until the coming of Shiloh. For through the proliferation of holy books by the printing press, will the Torah not be forgotten until the coming of Shiloh, who is Moses' Messiah. Zohar, Part 1, 234a. That is why the verse thus continues, "To whom is the gathering of peoples, who ties his colt to the vine, washing in wine, the eyes red from wine." In the future, with the coming of the Messiah, Moses and David will merge with ultimate oneness. For Shiloh is Moses, who is the Messiah, and David is also the Messiah, as written, "The Messiah of the God of Jacob." 2 Samuel 23:1. For the soul of the Messiah will be comprised of both of them, Moses and David. The redemption will then be complete, after which will be no other exile, for we will remember all of Moses' urgings and fulfill them completely through David, for Moses and David will merge together. This is, until the coming of Shiloh, to whom is the gathering of peoples, for all the nations, which are the 70 nations, will transform into the holy, and will all gather around Moses' Messiah. For the left will merge into the right, which corresponds to holy wine, which corresponds to David, as said. That is why the verse juxtaposes, "Who ties his colt to the vine, washing in wine, the eyes red from wine. All this corresponds to the chalice of wine for a blessing, which corresponds to holy wine, to wine that gladdens, which corresponds to the heated blood merging into holiness and thereby becoming enthused for God with great joy, which is attained with the merging together of Moses and David, thought and speech, the urging of the Torah and the effort to fulfill it, to loving God with both our inclinations, which corresponds to the written Torah and the oral Torah, to Torah and prayer. All this is made possible through the proliferation of the holy books of the Torah that are greatly increased by the printing press, through which the written Torah and the oral Torah are merged together by the holy books that explain to us the oral Torah, which are the authentic commentaries and interpretations of the Torah. Through this comes victory in the battle, which corresponds to holy wine, which is why the verse juxtaposes who ties his colt to the vine. 2. A staff and a scribe will never leave, which alludes to the benefit of the printing press, which is the perpetuation of the Torah. Section 7. This is, set me as a seal on your heart, as a seal on your forearm, for love is as brazen as death. Song of Songs 8:6. A seal corresponds to printing, which corresponds to inscribing, and a seal. The congregation of Israel is here, asking of God that it should always be bound to him through the seal, which corresponds to the printing press, through which holy books are increased, which is the perpetuation of the Torah. For love is as brazen as death. Its flames are flames of fire. The judgments, which are the heat of the bloods that have been transformed into holiness, the left that has been merged into the right, to become enthused specifically through them with flames of love, which corresponds to the merging of the oral Torah and the written Torah of Moses and David, which is attained through the proliferation of the holy books that is facilitated through the printing press, which corresponds to the holy seal. Section 8. This corresponds to the koshering of wine vessels by leaving them for 12 months. Yoreh 135:16. 12 months are a year, which is comprised of 365 days, paralleling the 365 blood vessels. Thus, when the containers of wine are left to sit for a year, the forbidden wine absorbed in them is ameliorated and dissipated, for the prohibition of the wine corresponds to the 365 blood vessels, in which is the blood. Thus, by allowing them to sit for a full year, which is comprised of 365 days, the blemish of the 365 blood vessels is thereby ameliorated and dissipated, through which the wine containers are koshered. This is because in every year there is one holy and awesome day that contains all of the 365 days, the day of Yom Kippur, which is comprised of all the 365 days of the year and is their rectification. As written, days will be formed, and to him is one of them. Psalms 139:16, which refers to Yom Kippur. Tana Debe, Eliyahu 1. For all sins that are caused by the bloods of the 365 blood vessels are atoned for and rectified, through which the blemish of wine, which is the blemish of the bloods, is rectified and ameliorated. This is why the Torah connected the entire service of Yom Kippur with the death of Aaron's sons, as written, after Aaron's 2 sons died. He shall not enter at all times, so that he will not die as his sons did. Leviticus 16:1. The entire Yom Kippur service is explained in that section. For Aaron's sons died for having blemished in wine they had entered into the temple while drunk. Leviticus Rabbah 12:1. So Yom Kippur is their rectification. Since Yom Kippur rectifies all of the 365 blood vessels, which correspond to the 365 negative commandments that are transgressed on account of the bloods, which correspond to a blemishing of wine. Thus, when the wine containers are left sitting for a year comprised of 365 days that are contained in Yom Kippur, through which they are rectified, This koshers the wine containers from the blemishing of wine, for the rectification of the blood in the 365 blood vessels that are rectified over the 365 days through Yom Kippur is the rectification of the wine. Section 9. These 12 months of the years that contain 365 days, and though there are years with less or more days, nevertheless, the typical year is 365 days. For that is the mystery of the intercalation, through which all years are filled and are all rendered, as 365 days correspond to the 12 tribes of God. Yalkut Shimoni, number 143. And for these 12 tribes were 12 precious stones, that the high priest bore on his heart, in which were engraved, as with the engravings of a seal, holy for God. Exodus 28:36. These 12 stones of the 12 tribes were the Urim V'Tumim, from which all counsel was sought, and from these stones that were engraved as with the engravings of a seal come all holy seals. This is the root of the power of the printing of the holy Jewish books, which correspond to a holy seal, as said, through which the interpretations of the Torah are made complete. For through them are rectified the bloods of the 365 blood vessels that parallel the 365 days that are comprised in the 12 months of the year, which parallel the 12 tribes, the 12 stones that are engraved as with the engravings of a seal, holy for God. For all strategies and ways of conduct were sought from the Urim V'Tumim. But today that we have no priest or Urim V'Tumim, and we have no one from whom to seek counsel, we have only the holy books of the Torah that are proliferated by the printing press, which is the holy seal. Hence, the seal of the printing press corresponds to the holy seal of the 12 stones borne by the high priest, from where it receives its power. Section 10. This is, your eyes saw my unformed body, and they were all inscribed in your book. Days were formed, and to him is one of them. Psalms 139:16, which is Yom Kippur, as said, your eyes saw my unformed body. God showed Adam every generation and its teachers. Genesis Rabbah 24:2. He showed him how the world will endure in these end of days preceding the Messiah, showing him that now the perpetuation of the Torah, which is the perpetuation of the world, will be through the proliferation of holy books that are increased through the holy seal, which is the printing press. Through this, they will all be written in your book, specifically all, for all the novel ideas of all the tzaddikim will all be written in your book. Since now everything is written clearly through the printing press, through which the written Torah and oral Torah are made complete, through which the bloods in the 365 blood vessels are rectified, which corresponds to Yom Kippur, as said. Thus, they will all be inscribed in your book. Days will be formed, and to him is one of them, which is Yom Kippur, for they are one and the same. Law 4. Regarding the prohibition of wine that becomes forbidden simply by the touch of a Gentile, nowhere else does touch make something forbidden. Based on the lesson in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 36. It is explained there that the main test and refinement of every human being is regarding sexual lust, which is the all-encompassing of all the lusts and bad traits of all the 70 nations. Every Jewish soul is rooted in the 70 souls of the house of Jacob, who correspond to the 70 shining faces, which correspond to the 70 faces of the Torah, countering which are the 70 nations that are attached to all of the lusts and bad traits. But it is impossible to reach a revelation of Torah and service without breaking through the shell that covers the fruit, which are all the lusts that are rooted in the all-encompassing lust. That is why Moses, who is the totality of the Torah, was so abstinent from this lust, whereas Balaam, Moses' counter in the shell, was so submerged in the filth of this lust. The rectification for sexual fantasies is to recite the Kriyat Shema and Baruch Shem and so forth. Study all this there well. Section 1. This corresponds to the prohibition of wine that has been touched by a Gentile. Wine is comprised of two aspects of good and of evil. For the root of wine in holiness is very exalted, since it is comprised of all of the 70 faces of the Torah, which correspond to the 70 souls of the house of Jacob, which correspond to the 70 elders. That is why our sages said, anyone whose mind becomes settled through wine possesses from the intelligence of the 70 elders. For wine is numerically 70, Eruvin 65a. But the opposite is also true. For the evil of all the 70 nations, which is the evil of all the lusts that are rooted and comprised in sexual lust, are attached to wine, as we see for ourselves how intoxication through wine confuses the mind and boils the blood, which leads to all the lusts, especially this all-encompassing one, as written, "Do not look at wine that it is red," Proverbs 23:31, that eventually becomes blood. Sanhedrin 70a, which is the boiling of the blood, which gives rise to the passion of this lust. The verse there also says about wine, "Your eyes will behold foreigners," Proverbs 23:33, upon which Rashi adds, "It entices the person to look at harlots specifically, your eyes, for it corresponds to the all-encompassing evil of the 70 nations, regarding which is said, 'Do not veer after your hearts or after your eyes,' Numbers 15:39, as the Rebbe cites there the verse in this context. Our sages thus said, wine is called a head. If one is deserving, one becomes a head, which corresponds to the mind, to the 70 faces of the Torah. For there is no wisdom as the wisdom of the Torah. But if one is not deserving, one becomes a pauper, which corresponds to the blemish of this lust. For it is the cause of poverty, as in, "He who follows harlots will lose a fortune," Proverbs 29:3. And, "For a prostituting woman, one would give a loaf of bread," Proverbs 6:26. As cited elsewhere in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 7, 11, 29, 60. Our sages thus said, "Whoever witnesses a suspected adulteress exposed as guilty should abstain from wine." Nazir 2a. Section 2. That is why we must protect wine carefully from the touch of a Gentile. For the Gentiles are attached to the evil of all the lusts that are rooted in this all-encompassing lust. Thus, immediately upon their touching the wine, it becomes utter evil. For the evil of the Gentiles, which is the antithesis of the holiness of the Jewish people, who are comprised within the 70 souls of the house of Jacob, has become attached to it, so it immediately becomes forbidden. Our sages thus said, their wine was forbidden because of their daughters. Shabbat 17b. For wine touched by Gentiles arouses the evil in it, which is sexual lust. So our sages decreed to prohibit their wine because of their daughters. Section 3. That is why even kosher Jewish wine should also be meticulously avoided by every Jewish person, as brought throughout the holy literature about how very greatly everyone must distance themselves from any intoxicating drink, especially overdrinking, that may lead to intoxication. The only one who is able to drink wine properly is an authentic tzaddik, who is completely refined of all this, who is utterly clear and refined of all lusts, especially the all-encompassing lust. Regarding such a one is said, if he is deserving, he becomes a head. For when he drinks wine, there is no touch of Gentile in it at all, which is the all-encompassing lust of the 70 nations. But whenever one who is not refined from lusts drinks wine, especially a lot, this allows for the touch of a Gentile to take hold of him, that the boiling of the blood, which corresponds to the evil of all the 70 nations, which corresponds to this lust, will be aroused. Section 4. It is in general improper to drink more than a bit of wine or other intoxicating beverage in order to expand one's mind, and even this only on Shabbat, festivals, or other holy meals. For the holiness of wine comes only from the holiness of Shabbat, which is the first of the festivals. the holiness of which comes entirely from Shabbat, which corresponds to the holiness of the authentic tzaddik who himself corresponds to Shabbat Zohar, Part 3, 144b, regarding whom is said, if one is deserving, one becomes a head. This corresponds to the recital of the Kiddush on Shabbat specifically over a chalice of wine, to channel the holiness of Shabbat specifically through wine for the holiness of Shabbat. Corresponds to all of the 70 faces of the Torah that shine mainly into Shabbat, the day on which the Torah was given. For Shabbat is the all-encompassing holiness of all of the 70 souls of the house of Jacob, of all the 70 shining faces that are the 70 faces of the Torah. This holiness is channeled specifically through the chalice of wine, for then the wine is at its ultimate holiness, corresponding to the intelligence of the 70 elders. For wine is numerically 70, which corresponds to the 70 words in the Kiddush. Tikkuni Zohar 47, paragraph 84a. For through the wine of the Kiddush, we channel all of the 70 faces, as said. That is why the time for the marital relations of Torah scholars is only on Shabbat, Ketubot 62b. For on Shabbat are channeled the 70 faces, which correspond to the 70 souls of the house of Jacob, who corresponds to the holiness of the covenant. So then, they are able to evoke a holy soul from the 70 souls. Section 5. But the most important thing is attachment to the authentic tzaddikim, who have already attained the holiness of the covenant to the utmost and ultimate wholeness, through whom anyone is able to evoke upon themselves the holiness of Shabbat, which corresponds to the holiness of the covenant, which corresponds to the 70 faces, the 70 souls. Specifically, then, are we able to drink a bit of wine on Shabbat and festivals to gladden one's soul and expand one's mind, so that one will become aroused to feel the sweet pleasantness of the holiness of the Torah, the holiness of the Jewish people, which corresponds to the holiness of Shabbat that is channeled upon us by the power of the authentic tzaddikim. For indeed, every individual knows in their heart that they lack the ability to evoke upon themselves the holiness of Shabbat, of the Jewish people, of the Torah, other than through the authentic tzaddikim who have already sanctified themselves of all lusts, especially the all-encompassing lust. They are our joy and our holiness, through whom God has compassion on us, so that the tzaddik will be able to arouse the bit of good in us, to feel the holiness of Shabbat and festivals, and to rejoice in God's salvation through the drinking of wine in proper measure, to thereby attain wine that gladdens, as in, wine gladdens the human heart, shining the face more than oil. Psalms 104:15. Corresponding to the 70 faces, and to be able, through the holy joy, to bond to God, and to intensely feel God's greatness, the greatness of the authentic tzaddikim, and the greatness of the Torah, each individual to the extent of their ability. Section 6. However, those who are accustomed to drinking a lot of wine in the evening and the morning every day of the week, such that they frequently become intoxicated even during the week, and as if that weren't enough, they also intensely oppose the authentic tzaddikim and their followers, grinding their teeth against them and attacking them in all ways of opposition and mockery, even literally inciting their bloodshed. Regarding them is written, "Do not see blood, that it is red, that will literally become blood." Sanhedrin 70a, by their facilitating the bloodshed of upright Jewish people. This is, to whom is woe, to whom is wail, to the one who has strife, to the one who has arguments, to whom are unnecessary wounds, to the one whose eyes are red, to the ones who are up late over wine. Proverbs 23:29-30. Such people enormously increase dispute among the Jewish people until they come to unnecessary blows and wounds, talking and arguing and mocking all the ways of the authentic upright who follow the paths of our holy ancestors and teachers of old. Regarding this is said, the mocker, the drinker of wine, calls out for intoxicating beverage. Whoever errs in it will not become wise. There, 21. Even one who is a bit upright and is not immediately aroused by drinking wine to complete mockery, but only errs in it, erring on account of the drinking and deluding himself until he overturns the truth. This will lead him to speak falsely against the authentic, God-fearing, who appear to him as having veered from the truth. Yet his entire error and mistake came about on account of drinking too much wine every day. So he too will certainly not become wise. As in, whoever errs in it will not become wise, for he was undeserving in his drinking to become a head, to attain intelligence and wisdom, but just the opposite. As in, if one is not deserving, one becomes impoverished, and the ultimate poverty is a lack of intelligence. Nedarim 41a. As in, if one is not deserving, it empties the mind. Yoma 76b. For the intelligence becomes confused and emptied, such that one speaks great falsehoods and lies about the authentic tzaddikim and their followers. Section 7. And the entire extended exile, due to our many sins, is caused by this. For the exile is ultimately caused by the exile of Jewish souls in their lusts and bad traits, which are rooted in sexual lust. As explained in the lesson, how every Jewish soul must inevitably enter this exile, which becomes expressed as a material exile. The only thing to do is to call and cry out to God profusely. As explained in the lesson, literally call out 70 cries as a birthing woman. But those who drink wine not only are distant from all of these authentic ways, but they even mock those who do follow them, those who devote themselves to prayer and crying out to God profusely to be spared from the bitterness of this collective and individual exile. As every single individual knows in their heart the bitterness of the soul, how the exile of the lusts are so overwhelming, but by their mocking those people, saying bad things about them, attacking them and pursuing them in all types of ways, they thereby cause very many to be distanced from these authentic ways of crying out and praying to God at all times, on account of which the exile of the lusts intensifies even more, on account of which the material exile is extended even more due to our many sins, for each is dependent upon the other. And though we have no idea what to do to be spared from them, God knows the hidden things of the heart, that our intention is truly for heaven, and we have no one to rely on other than on our Father in heaven. So we remain firm in our stations, to cry out to God with all our strength, until He looks and sees from heaven to save us from all types of exiles, from the exile in the lusts, from the exile among the 70 nations, and from the exile amidst our own Jewish brethren who hate us, which is the worst of all. For the destruction of the Second Temple was ultimately caused by dispute and unjustified hatred, which is the main cause of the extension of the exile, due to our many sins, as known and understood by anyone with true understanding. This is why King David said, "Those who sit at the gate talk about me, and those who drink intoxicating beverage sing songs. But as for me, my prayer is to you, O God, at a time of desire." Psalms 69:13. To counter the profuse dispute of the enemies who speak and talk evil, who are urged on by their profuse drinking intoxicating beverage, I have no strategy other than prayer and supplication to God, as in, "As for me, my prayer is to you, O God." Section 8. For this reason we recite this verse, "As for me, my prayer." At the Shabbat afternoon service, the 70 faces of Torah are channeled mainly on Shabbat afternoon, at which time everything ascends to the ultimate supernal holiness of Shabbat Zohar, Part 2, 88b, Pri Etz Chaim, Shabbat, Chapter 22. So, Shabbat afternoon is the peak time for the refinement and sorting out of wine, through which we receive the holiness of Shabbat, which corresponds to the 70 faces when wine is in great holiness. But the ultimate wholeness of the holiness of wine, which is the holiness of the 70 faces of the Torah, is received most greatly on Shabbat afternoon, for at that time are completely eliminated all judgments, from which the evil in the wine, which corresponds to blood, to judgments, draws its power when everything is ameliorated and eliminated through the holiness of Shabbat. When we recite Kiddush over wine, though the ultimate amelioration and elimination of judgments is channeled on Shabbat afternoon, the time of desire of desires, when we declare, "Come close, see my might," that there are no harsh judgments, which is as said. That is why we recite at this time the verse, "As for me, my prayer." For we now evoke the time of desire to eliminate all judgments, from which devolves the evil of all those who drink intoxicating beverages, who bring forth all the judgments, accusations, and disputes. For everything is then ameliorated and eliminated through profuse loving kindness that is channeled at the time of desire on Shabbat afternoon, when Moses, Joseph, and David departed. Zohar, Part 2, 156a. This is because their profuse and enormous dispute can only be ameliorated and eliminated through the power of the great authentic tzaddikim who departed at the time of desire. For the greater the judgment, the more loving kindness that must be channeled to ameliorate and eliminate it, and the great judgments and disputes of the drinkers of intoxicating beverages is impossible to eliminate other than through the greatness of the time of desire that is evoked by the power of the departing of the great tzaddikim. Section 9. This is why the Jewish people are called in exile, intoxicated, but not from wine. Isaiah 51:21. The exile corresponds to intoxication, which corresponds to the evil of wine, which is the evil of the 70 nations, which are their evil lusts, which are the cause of all exiles. This is, they circle around and move like a drunkard. Psalms 107:27. And the only rectification for this is, they cried out to God, corresponding to the 70 cries, which corresponds to, "As for me, my prayer." Laws of Idolatry. Section 10. This corresponds to our sages' teaching. An idolatrous icon of a Jewish person cannot be nulled, Avodah Zarah 52b, unlike that of a Gentile that can be nulled. Everything was created for the Jewish people, since God, the Torah, and the Jewish people are all one, and the entire life energy of all worlds, from highest to lowest, is all channeled only through the Jewish people. Even all the life energy that trickles down to the realm of evil and the shell from holiness, all comes through the Jewish people, who are the foundation and root of everything. That is why the realm of evil and the shells have no power beyond what they draw from the Jewish people. However, the Jewish people, given their etheric spiritual roots, are essentially completely distant from sin. And so the power of the inclination for evil to cause them to sin is by clothing itself in the commandments, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 1, which itself is channeled through a Jewish demon, Zohar, Part 3, 253a. For there are Jewish demons who draw nourishment from the Noga, which corresponds to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, from which arise all errors and confusions in the world they correspond to. The flame of the revolving sword, Genesis 3:24, which turns into countless many colors, confusing and distorting the heart of each individual, according to the error and confusion that they introduce into their heart. This is accomplished by first clothing themselves in commandments, then misleading the person until they are trapped in their net, until they bring them to all types of sins, ultimately even to literal idolatry. As our sages said, today it says, "Do this," until Shabbat 105b. Thus, the main power of the inclination for evil comes through dispute. Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 62. For those Jewish demons are mainly focused on and endeavoring to distort the Jewish heart to increase descent, for through that they are greatly empowered to clothe themselves in their many commandments, poisoning the heart of whoever follows them, so that the other person has veered from the truth and hates him, and it is therefore a great mitzvah to pursue that other person to death, and so on, with similar false ideas, as are so common in the world today due to our many sins. But most of all, these Jewish demons endeavor to clothe themselves in Torah scholars who are not careful enough in their ways to avoid them, for the inclination for evil is most attached to them. As our sages said, the inclination for evil overlooks all Jewish people and attacks only the Torah scholars. Sukkah 52a. And this is accomplished mainly through the Jewish demons who clothe themselves in deficient Torah students and scholars. Zohar, Part 3, 125b, 253a, 277a, such that their hearts become distorted against the authentic upright, which gives them the perceived right and obligation to attack and pursue them based upon the deficiencies and the blemishes that they project onto them, until they feel obligated to pursue them for no reason at all. This is, to the one who has strife, to the one who has arguments, the acronym of which is Jewish Shed Yehudi, from whom all strife, argument, and dispute arise. Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 28. All this can be derived from the lesson. It is stated there that only a simple light descends from on high that takes on form below for each individual based upon their personal vessel. Study there well, which corresponds to, if one is deserving, the Torah becomes for them a potion of life, and if one is not deserving, the Torah becomes for them a potion of death. Yoma 72b, which is every individual's ultimate choice. Thus, whoever seeks to have compassion on their eternal life must cry out profusely to God and to focus their mind on God at all times, to beg of Him to lead them along the proper path with absolute authenticity and not allow them to fool themselves. For the general rule is that each individual will be led along the path that they desire to follow. Makot 10b, as we find regarding Balaam, whom God told, "Go with them," Numbers 22:20, even though this was not God's will at all. There are many hidden mysteries in this, for precisely at that juncture is the essence of free choice, which is a novelty more amazing than all the novelties and wonders that God created, as explained in the literature. The ultimate choice is at that crossroads from which one will be led along that path which one desires. As our sages said, one who comes to purify themselves will be assisted. One who comes to defile themselves will be allowed. Shabbat 104a, as in, for you look at evil doing and outrage, even allowing with your hand. Psalms 10:14. This is the essence of the exile of the Shekhinah, that every individual according to their deeds imprisons and restrains the Shekhinah with God, so to speak, in exile, such that it is said, "He who is imprisoned cannot free himself from prison." Tikkuni Zohar, pages 9a, 21b, 22a to b. The Rebbe thus writes that by teaching an unfit student, one may become imprisoned, for the student may stumble even more because he is unfit and will turn the words of God on their head, on account of which will God and the Shekhinah become imprisoned, so to speak, in his evil mind, that the light will take form according to his evil intelligence. This is the exile of God, as if he is imprisoned and trapped in prison, for he is trapped, so to speak, in the mind of the unfit student, such that he is forced to lead and help him according to his ideas, all because of the power of free choice, which is extremely great. This was the wicked Balaam's strategy to cause the Israelites to sin. His strategy was very deep, for he sought to cause specifically the leaders of the people to sin, plotting to seduce even Moses, Sanhedrin 82a, and though they were unsuccessful with this, they did succeed in causing an Israelite prince, a leader of the generation, to sin. And not only did he sin so gravely, But the forces of evil goaded him on to bring the Midianite woman before Moses in order to make a public demonstration that would demolish the taboo against improper sexual conduct. That was the essence of the intention of the wicked Balaam and the forces of evil, to cause so much wickedness such that the truth would be completely overturned, rendering a sin into a mitzvah. For Balaam was very defiled, there 105b, and developed his wickedness and witchery to such a degree that he channeled upon himself a spirit of prophecy, becoming a very great prophet. Numbers, Rabbah 14:19. All through the great power of free choice, in the human power to force a spirit of prophecy to descend upon oneself as one wishes, to draw the supernal light and give it form as one wishes. The Israelites were thus in very great danger at that time, as written, "My people, please remember what Balak schemed against you, and how Balaam responded to him." Micha 6:5. Brachot 7a. And the Zohar states that the Jewish people have never been in such grave danger as then, all because of the great power of a free-willed creature. But God had compassion on the people and formed the light by himself into a blessing, as explained in the lesson. Thus, the main cause of the extension of the exile is dispute and unjust hatred. This is what caused the Second Temple to be destroyed, Yoma 9b, and this sin still dances among us, extending the exile ever longer. For though, in our own liability, we are plagued by many sins, especially the blemishing of the covenant, which is so prevalent, may God save us henceforth. Nevertheless, it is all rectified by the authentic tzaddik in each generation, who shines authentic, holy ways into the Jewish people to bring them back from their evil ways and to rectify them all. However, the forces of evil are so widespread today to distance people from the authentic tzaddik who has this power, concocting lies and falsehoods against him during his lifetime and even after his departing, as well as against his followers, such that the evil has clothed itself in the leaders of the generation, leading them to believe it to be a mitzvah to pursue and attack them. All those leaders who oppose him, who are wise in their own eyes, are the Jewish demon scholars who constantly distort the truth, for that is the essential power of the inclination for evil. Thus, the rectification comes through the channeling of the authentic truth that comes from the light of the Messiah that shines into the depth of the exile, for without that, we would be completely unable to survive. The ultimate completion of the rectification will come about through our righteous Messiah, who is Moses himself, as written, until the coming of Shiloh, Genesis 49:10, who is Moses Messiah, Zohar, Part 1, 25b. For then he will correct his mistake of striking the rock, from which arose the root of holy dispute, as stated in the Holy Zohar. If Moses had not struck the rock, the rabbis would not have had to toil in their study. Tikkunei Zohar, 21, paragraph 44a. It was the striking of the rock that caused the toil of the rabbis in their study, on account of which arose many disputes regarding Torah law, from which devolved the disputes of the realm of evil among the Jewish people, on account of which the temple was destroyed and the exile is still extending, and the rectification will be brought about by the Messiah, who is Moses himself. Thus, an idolatrous icon of a Jewish person cannot be nulled, for even the power of idolatry is itself from the above errors propagated by the Jewish demons, claiming even that one must worship idols, for that is God's will. All the Gentiles, in fact, acknowledge God, calling him the God of gods, Menachot 110a, only saying that his will is that we worship these or those intermediaries, thereby overturning truth to such an extent that they claim that it is a mitzvah to worship idols. This was also how Jeroboam caused the Israelites to sin all through the Jewish demons, who clothed themselves in Torah scholars, as Jeroboam himself was very great in Torah, as our sages said on the verse in 1 Kings 11:29, Sanhedrin 100:2a. Thus, the idolatrous icons of a Jewish person cannot be nulled, For the essence of the power of idolatry, which is the inclination for evil that is called a foreign god, comes entirely only when it draws nourishment from the Jewish people through the Jewish demons. That is why, when the idolatrous icon is Jewish, it has even greater power from the realm of evil, which is why it can never be nulled and must be only incinerated and completely annihilated. Amen. May it be the will. Draft Notes. Section 11. Canisters of libated wine are forbidden because the essence of the blemishing of wine, which is the blemishing of the mind, is caused by the blemishing of the vessels through the blemishing of the covenant, as explained in the lesson. Thus, even if the wine and the mind have not currently been touched by a Gentile, since they have been placed into canisters in which there had previously been wine mind that had been touched by a Gentile, they are forbidden to a Jewish person. For the essence of the blemishing of wine and mind comes through the blemishing of the vessels. Section 12. The ultimate root of free choice is from the free choice of the great tzaddikim who correspond to Moses, whose only free choice is as was Moses, who added an extra day on his own initiative, Shabbat. 87a, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 190, evoking holiness, abstinence, and holiness of the covenant beyond what he had been explicitly instructed by God. His free choice was entirely in making that decision, from which free choice devolved to every Jewish person. Thus, every individual also possesses some aspect of Moses' choice in some hidden way, in having to come to one's own understanding of God's will and that of the authentic tzaddik, and to not fool oneself, but to focus one's intelligence intensely upon God, to the point of complete surrender. For one will be led along that path that one seeks to follow. God thus said to Moses, "Go, tell them, return to your tents, but you stay here with me." Deuteronomy 5:27. And if only the people had remained with him. But the forces of evil attacked them intensely, mainly through this lust, ultimately leading them to worship the golden calf in order to break the taboo of improper sexual conduct, Sanhedrin 63b. And after that they sinned further and tested God several times. For dispute makes the wise foolish and causes the loss of gifted heart. Ecclesiastes 7:7. For even Moses himself erred in striking the rock, and his error and choice was then certainly also in the category of adding an extra day, in that he had to ascertain God's will, but due to the great confusion of the intense dispute against him specifically, at the time of the waters of dispute, it escaped him, and he was unable to ascertain the innermost will of God, on account of which he departed. And Moses' soul spreads throughout all generations, Tikkuni Zohar 69:112, to rectify the Jewish people in every generation, and to rectify his striking of the rock, from which arose the entire dispute, as said, which was caused by those errors that arise from a person's being led along the path that they seek to follow, on account of which the Jewish demons are able to greatly mislead. But the ultimate rectification will come through the Messiah, who is Moses himself, when he will be able to fully ascertain God's will and intelligence, and will never again err, through which he will rectify the free choice of every individual, so that they will all truly return to God, each one to the extent of their level, such that even all the Gentiles will return to God, as in, "Then I will turn to all the nations a clear tongue," Zephaniah 3:9. All this still needs to be further explained, for there is much to discuss about it, with God's help. This is, "I will give them one heart and one path to fear me," Jeremiah 32:39, that they will have no more doubts. The angel stood in a narrow place, where there was no way to veer to the right or to the left, and Balaam was enraged and struck the mare. Numbers 22:26-27. A boor does not know, and a fool does not understand. Psalms 92, 7. So Balaam claimed, "I did not know that you were standing in my way. May his spirit and soul leave him. Is not the entire earth filled with God's glory? If God is able to constrict himself to speak with you, how can you not understand his illusions that he wants to prevent you from complete self-destruction? But since God saw his great wickedness, so a person is led along the path that they seek to follow, and he told him, 'Go.' But the upright Jewish people, no matter what they are enduring, understand that everything is for the good, for everything is from God. As written, if they are imprisoned in chains, so that they turn away from evil doing." Job 36, 8-10. Crying out to him and returning to him, for they hear God's voice and his illusions from everything that they experience. This is, as a result of your hearing these laws, Deuteronomy 7:12, specifically meaning when one is beneath the heel and feet, that one is being tread upon underfoot, as in, "You had people tread on our heads," Psalm 66:12, and in, "to crush beneath his feet all the imprisoned on earth," Lamentations 3:34. Specifically then, when in a situation of a heel, when one is able to then hear these laws, that everything is a decree from on high that has been clothed in this earthly event in order to bring one back to God, then your God will keep for you the covenant. This is, Jacob's hand was holding onto Esau's heel, Genesis 25:26. Specifically, onto the heel, when Esau will be empowered at the end of the exile and attempt to trample upon the head of the Jewish people with his heel, as in, "He set a heel upon me," Psalms 41:10, which corresponds to the heels of the Messiah. Specifically then, will Jacob's hand, corresponding to faith and prayer, hold onto his heel in order to trip him. This corresponds to who bites the heels of a horse, and its rider falls backward, Genesis 49:17. For Samson corresponds to the Messiah, Genesis Rabbah 98:14. Section 13. This corresponds to the mitzvah of sanctifying the name. Among the details of the laws in Yoreh, Laws of Idolatry, number 157, it is explained that if life threatened to transgress a sin, one should rather sin than allow oneself to be killed, except for the sins of idolatry, incest, or bloodshed, for which one must allow oneself to be killed rather than transgress. But even in all other sins, if a Gentile intends to force one to transgress Jewish law in public, in front of 10 Jews, one must allow oneself to be killed. And the same applies during a time of a general decree against Jewish law, when one must allow oneself to be killed even for the customary Jewish color of a shoelace. In sum, based upon the above, the greatest blemish and damage of all sins in the Torah is overturning the words of the living God, overturning the truth into falsehood and the falsehood into truth, as written, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who make light into darkness and darkness into light." Isaiah 5:20, which is the worst thing of all, for through that are the Jewish people and the entire world led astray. All this comes about through what is stated in the lesson on the verse, "I have taken a blessing," Numbers 23:20, that from on high only descends a simple light that takes form below for each individual, according to their level, according to the grasp of their mind, which are the vessels that receive the light. And the rectification or damage of the vessels is dependent upon the rectification of the covenant or its damage. Everything is dependent upon that. So that is the main battle waged by the forces of evil, and the deceitful ways in which they ambush and seek to trap every single individual, especially the great ones and the leaders. And the greater they are, the more they seek to ambush them. As our sages said, whoever is greater than another, their inclination for evil is greater than the others. And as they said there on the verse, its stench will rise up, and its fetor will ascend. For it has acted greatly. It attacked the great ones. Joel 2:20, Sukkah 52a. This was what caused the destructions of the first and second temples, as they explain there on the verse. Its face to the first sea and its back to the last sea, and still wreaks havoc on account of this same issue. All troubles and the extension of the exile are also caused by this, for as known in general, and as every individual knows the wounds and pains of their heart in the privacy of their soul, what each one endures regarding this evil lust, which is the all-encompassing lust of the 70 nations, which is sexual lust, of which virtually no one is properly cleansed, and in which many have grievously blemished except for the greatest of the great tzaddikim, the few singular ones of all generations who boasted with authentic pride of the enormous force of their power and holiness regarding this, as our sages have told. But virtually no one else, including the upright and somewhat righteous, is appropriately cleansed, and to the extent of the blemishing of each individual, so are the vessels of their mind damaged, on account of which they lack the ability to properly receive and form the supernal light for the good. Thus, every individual must guard their soul carefully to refrain from being wise in one's own eyes, to veer after the empty wisdoms so widespread in the world, especially in these generations in which people mock sacred acts, especially prayer with devotion, as our sages said, as exalted, so scorned by people. Psalms 12:9. These are those things that stand at the peak of the world, but people scorn them, specifically prayer. Brachot 6b. And the entire power of these mockers and scorners of the upright of the generation who toil to pray with devotion is from those errors, by overturning the words of the living God, such that the Torah becomes for them a potion of death, as in, if one is not deserving. They thus speak falsehoods and lies and all types of mockery against the truly upright, claiming that they are transgressing the Torah, and that by Torah law they should be attacked and pursued in all ways, financially and even physically, literally endangering their lives. All this comes about on account of those errors that are caused by a blemishing of the covenant, on account of which the vessels of the mind are blemished, and one overturns the light of the Torah to its very opposite. This damage is brought about mainly by the prominent ones and the leaders who are not properly cleansed of this lust. And if that were not enough, they also do not acknowledge their places on account of their lust for status and honor, begrudging the upright who are not submissive to them and seeking to undermine them, scrutinizing them with an evil eye to find in them all their own deficiencies and blemishes. But a person is led along the path that they seek to follow, so the forces of evil are empowered to distort their minds, to the extent that these people fool themselves and claim that the Torah demands that those upright ones must be pursued, especially by spreading slanderous lies and gossip against them, as so prevalent due to our many sins. But whoever desires to be a truly upright person, to reflect upon one's authentic purpose, and to bring oneself close to people of truth, innocent in their ways, who follow God's Torah as received from the authentic tzaddikim who preceded us, cannot possibly withstand all those who rise up against them without literally being willing to surrender their lives. For truth has become so confused such that it is impossible to ascertain the truth without literal self-surrender for the sanctification of the name, which is rooted in the holiness of the soul of every single Jewish person to surrender their soul for the sanctification of the name, as we have witnessed simple and even uncouth people who surrendered their lives for the sanctification of the name. Section 14. Thus, generally, one should transgress all sins in the Torah rather than allow oneself to be killed. For all commandments and prohibitions of sin in the Torah are for the purpose of giving form to the supernal light, for the good and for blessing, rather than for the opposite. For the ultimate root of the entire Torah is the holy faith, through which we know of God. As written, I will betroth you with faith, and you will know God. Hosea 2:22. And all your commandments are faith. Psalms 119:86. For the essence of creation was only in order that God will be known, However, as known, God is extremely exalted and beyond the grasp of our minds, especially since we are clothed in such a putrid physical body to which Adam's sin is attached, as well as the fact that one was not born out of holiness, not to speak of what one has damaged by oneself. Yet, nevertheless, God has compassion on us for His sake and shines into the intelligence of each individual through the power of the authentic tzaddikim, the truth of the holy faith, to hold oneself onto to God and His holy Torah, which is our eternal life. But the light that descends from on high is very exalted, since it is the simple light, and each individual must give it form according to the grasp of their mind. And not every individual is able to give form to this light for the good, since the vessels of the minds of most of them are not appropriately prepared. That is why God had compassion on us and gave us the holy Torah of 248 commandments and 365 prohibitions, as well as the rabbinical commandments, all of which correspond to the holy form that can give form to the light for blessing. And He warned us to avoid all the prohibitions, which are all acts that damage and blemish, for through them the light is formed counter to holiness. That is the totality of the entire Torah and commandments, and all Kabbalistic intentions and secrets of the commandments are contained in this. For there are many aspects regarding the forming of the light of the Most High, for the good or for the opposite, which is the totality of all the attributes, all the sfirot, and all the holy names upon which are dependent the intentions of all the commandments, all of which are related to how the light must be formed for the good through each specific mitzvah, and the opposite will be formed by sins. The vitality of the human being and of all worlds is dependent upon all this, for this is our source of life, since the essence of vitality comes through the supernal light that descends from on high when one is able to give it form for a blessing, in which case the light binds with the vessels, which is the essence of vitality, as known, and the opposite. Thus, it might seem at first thought that one should surrender one's life for all commandments in the Torah, for how can one transgress any mitzvah, being that the form of the light would be immediately damaged to the extent of the blemish of that mitzvah, so from where would one then receive vitality? But God's compassion is very great, and He warned us from doing this, decreeing that no mitzvah stands in the way of survival, besides the cardinal 3 sins, since the Torah was given for life and not for death. Yoma 85b, because the life of a Jewish person is extremely precious to God. An entire lifetime one is involved in receiving this light from on high and giving it form for the good, from which one receives one's vitality. For the human being was only created to do the will of God throughout their lives based upon the Torah, through which they give form to the light for a blessing according to the root of their soul, upon which is dependent the rectification of all worlds that are related and dependent upon each individual. Thus, one should transgress all sins in the Torah rather than allow oneself to be killed, for those sins damage the form that must give form to the light as a blessing. Nevertheless, one must not allow oneself to be killed for this, since the life of a Jewish person is very precious. Because if one will go on living, one will give form to the light as a blessing in the future through the other commandments that one will do for the rest of one's life. As our sages said, better to desecrate one Shabbat than to desecrate many there. The totality of the human life corresponds to 70 years. As written, our years in them are 70 years. Psalms 90:10. And the vitality of these 70 years that a person lives comes from the 70 faces of the Torah, through which the light is formed for the good, which is why the individual must guard their soul and life. As written, you shall guard your souls carefully, Deuteronomy 4:15. For as long as one is alive, one needs the soul greatly to form the light for the good in order to complete the 70 faces of the Torah, according to one's portion and root. That is why it is worthwhile to transgress a commandment rather than be killed, for one will yet be able to rectify a lot by forming the light for the good. However, Rather than commit idolatry, incest, or bloodshed, one must allow oneself to be killed. For through these sins is the form of the light so damaged that the truth is completely overturned to its opposite, on account of which it would no longer be possible for one to form the light for the good, since one has already completely overturned the truth. That is why one must allow oneself to be killed rather than transgress one of these sins. Idolatry, which is denial of God, certainly uproots a person completely. For since one completely overturns the channeling of the light, such that one substitutes God's glory and denies Him, following instead the emptiness of idolatry. As written, "My people have substituted my glory without benefit." Jeremiah 2:11. How then can one go on living and give form to the light for the good, since one has already overturned and substituted the truth for its complete opposite? For this reason, one who acknowledges idolatry is tantamount to denying the entire Torah, Sifri, Rei, 2, which is why one must allow oneself to be killed. Since one will no longer be able to form the light for the good, this is also why one must allow oneself to be killed rather than commit incest. The ultimate blemish of the vessels of the mind is caused by the blemish of sexual immorality. So, obviously, one must allow oneself to be killed rather than commit such a sin, for through incest will the vessels of one's mind be so extensively damaged, such that for the rest of one's life, one will no longer be able to form the light for the good, since regarding this is said, "All who enter her will not return and will not attain the paths of life." Proverbs 2:19. That is why one must inevitably allow oneself to be killed, rather than commit this sin. For this sin would completely damage one's vessels, such that one will be unable to form the light for the good. What good is such a life? One would only go on damaging even more after the vessels of one's mind have already been damaged, since the ultimate blemish of the vessels is caused by sexual immorality, as said. As for bloodshed, this too requires surrender of one's life, for we need every single Jewish person in order to form the light for the good. All Jewish people are contained within the 70 souls of the house of Jacob, which correspond to the 70 faces of the Torah, through which the light is formed for the good. So certainly one must allow oneself to be killed rather than commit this sin, for one soul is not pushed aside to save another, for the other soul is also needed to give form to the light for the good. Even the lowest and most insignificant Jewish person, even though they may have no idea at all about forming the light for the good, nevertheless, since they are a Jewish person who has not renounced and denied the faith, they rectify many things through their deeds and commandments. For even the empty ones among them are as filled with commandments as a pomegranate, rectify great things, and form the light for the good. Section 15. The greatly enormous blemish of dispute is now self-evident, for it leads to bloodshed on several levels, usually leading to literal bloodshed. The forces of evil wait in ambush, especially against the important leaders in the country whom the forces of evil have set up over the Jewish people, whose vessels of mind are not properly rectified on account of the blemish of this lust that is so prevalent, and on account of the lust for glory and greatness. These leaders, in their haughtiness, forget their true places, such that it seems to them that the Torah demands that the upright who speak out against them must be pursued, for the truth has been overturned for them through, if one is not deserving, by the light having been given form by their blemished vessels. Furthermore, most of these leaders' followers are very blemished, among whom are great philanderers, many of whom are well-known lechers and adulterers, as common nowadays. All these lechers become followers of those leaders with smooth talk, concocting lies and great falsehoods against the authentic tzaddik and his followers, publicly calling for their bloodshed, all because the light was formed for them, not for the good, on account of the damaged vessels. For the forces of evil are not satisfied by just causing a person to stumble in some sin, be it even in very great sins, and the ultimate intention is to uproot the person completely by ambushing them to distort their mind by damaging the vessels until the forbidden becomes permissible, a sin becomes a mitzvah, and evil clothes itself in its commandments, through which it is able to completely uproot the person. But there is no greater area in which the forces of evil are able to mislead a person and to transform sins into commandments than regarding dispute. There, the forces of evil are in full force. This is because regarding dispute, it is easy to clothe itself in commandments and to transform great sins in the Torah into great commandments, for it incites one individual against another, claiming that it is a great mitzvah to pursue them, for they have done such and such, as is so common in the world. For as known, there is no one without some deficiencies or some bad trait, but we are commanded not to look at the evil in a fellow Jew, but only at the good, and to judge everyone to the side of merit, as our sages urged us in several places. But on account of the lust for self-vindication and dispute, evil is empowered to wait in ambush, to watch only for the evil, to seek and analyze, and find some evil in everyone else, especially in the upright, who desire the authentic truth, against whom the forces of evil incite the contentious ones the most to look closely with the evil eye, to find in them many deficiencies, and to concoct against them countless lies and falsehoods, until shedding their blood becomes a great mitzvah, calling for their bloodshed, and shedding their blood as water through abusive scorning and disgracing and public defamations, until literally calling for their bloodshed. All this on account of the light having been formed for them, not for the good on account of their damaged vessels. This is what the prophet cries out against in many places, against the leaders who are not leading the people with appropriate compassion. I am enraged against the leaders. Zechariah 10:3, and God will take the leaders of his people and its officers to justice. Why are you oppressing my people and crushing the faces of the poor? Isaiah 3:14, and woe, futile leader, sword on his arm and on his right eye. His arm will dry up and his right eye will dim. Zechariah 11:17, and many others, for the greatest damage is caused by the leaders. Section 16. Thus, every individual must search their own soul, so that they do not abandon the ways of true innocence, but constantly assess their path and guard their soul meticulously, so that they are not swayed from the truth by the forces of evil, so that they do not turn the truth into falsehood, a sin into a mitzvah. For that is the worst thing of all. One must remind oneself all the time that one is not cleansed of this lust, and that the grasp of the vessels of one's mind are not complete. And even if one is a great and prominent Torah scholar and is also considered pious, nevertheless, since one knows in one's own heart that one's righteousness and piety, especially regarding this lust, is not properly complete, and therefore the grasp of one's mind is not complete. Therefore, as soon as the forces of evil seek to lead one a step away from the path of authentic innocence, one must question whether this is because one is not deserving. And even if it seems that one's conclusion is based upon the Torah, perhaps it is because the light has been formed for other than the good, which itself is because one is not deserving. Thus, one must be very cautious not to fool oneself, not to overturn the words of the living God, but especially, more than anything else, one must be extremely cautious to avoid dispute, that at least one will not sustain a dispute and not fool oneself that it is a mitzvah to shed blood, to pursue another Jewish person, all the more so the upright of the generation. One must not listen to the words of the inciters and the misleaders, even if they are citing those leaders mentioned above. One should suffice oneself with the 613 commandments that we have received from Moses, and not add extra commandments for oneself, such as these, which all come from the forming of the light for other than the good, which corresponds to if one is not deserving. Section 17. As related to the service of God itself, there is also much to say, for a person is led along the path that they seek to follow, and if one makes the effort to have very strong desires and yearnings for God, one will be led firmly along the good and holy path, all to the extent of the formation of the light for the good, which is to the extent of the grasp of one's mind. Thus, one must indeed call out and cry out to God profusely, at all times perhaps. Perhaps one will be able to come properly close to God. That is why indeed King David cried out profusely for this, as written, "Teach me, O God, your ways. I will follow your truth." Psalms 86:11. Teach me, O God, your ways and guide me along the straightforward path. There, 27:11. Teach me, O God, the way of your statutes. There, 119:33. Send your light and your truth. They will guide me. There, 43:3, and countless other verses. He also cries out profusely that God grant him good strategies, as written, "Until when will I set strategies in my soul?" There, 13:3, and guide me with your strategy. There, 73:24, for great merit, salvation, and compassion, beyond lifelong great effort and toil, are needed for one to be able to constantly follow the holy path with absolute authenticity, never veering to the right or to the left, such that one will attain what a Jewish person should attain during the few years of one's earthly life, never to fool oneself in any way on account of the malforming of the light, on account of one's damaged vessels. But when one at least is careful never to veer from the ways of innocence, one is at least assured from completely stumbling, for one who walks innocently walks securely. Proverbs 10:9. Whereas, when one veers after the empty wisdoms so prevalent today, especially regarding dispute and unjust hatred, one may fall without support and forfeit one's world in a moment. Section 18. It is work enough for one to focus on appropriately improving one's own deeds before one can even consider attempting to improve someone else's and against their will, especially when one sees that the other person is better than oneself in several ways and prays with more devotion. So how can one even consider searching in them for deficiencies and judging them harshly, rebuking them and shaming them unjustly, thus increasing dispute and bloodshed? Even regarding a sinner, the Torah has warned us, "Rebuke your friend, but do not bear a sin for him." Leviticus 19:17. Do not shame him in public. Our sages indeed thus said. Rabbi Akiva said, "I wonder if there is anyone in this generation who knows how to rebuke Erchin 16b, upon which Rashi comments, in a way that one will not bear sin for them by shaming them." Also there is said, Rabbi Yehuda asked, which is better, rebuke with pure intentions or humility with ulterior motives? Humility with ulterior motives is better, upon which Rashi comments, humility with ulterior motives means when one acts with humility in order to avoid rebuking another, which is considered an ulterior motive, but it nevertheless is better than rebuking with pure intentions. Thus, all the more so in these generations, in which even one who is truly upright, with authentic, holy intentions, for whom it is surely a great mitzvah to speak to another's heart and lead them to the true path, must not rebuke them in public and shame them, and certainly not to argue with them, and all the more so not to maintain a dispute with them. For as our sages said, dispute is loathsome and peace is great. Genesis Rabbah 38:6. And all the more so is this relevant for those who sit at street corners drinking intoxicating beverage, who rise up against the upright and God-fearing, which is a fulfillment of the verse, "A youth will act impudently toward an elder." Isaiah 3:5. All this is caused by the power of the inappropriate leaders who were misled by the Jewish demons by their not having formed the light properly for the good. Section 19. This is, from the mouth of God comes neither evil nor good. Over what, therefore, can a living person lament? Lamentations 3:38. From the mouth of God comes neither evil nor good, contains the entire above concept, that from on high descends only a simple light. As the Rebbe indeed cites this verse in the lesson, in this context, every individual must form the light according to the grasp of their mind, and thus, over what therefore can a living person lament? Every man over his sins. For every individual must overcome their inclination for evil, wailing and mourning over their sins that have piled up over their head, so that one will be able to form the light properly for the good. The verse thus continues, "Let us search and assess our ways and return to God." One must certainly search their ways and diligently seek for the good and upright path with absolute authenticity in order to be able to return to God. For since only a simple light descends from on high, which corresponds to, "From the mouth of God comes neither evil nor good," and that every individual must form the light according to the grasp of their mind, which corresponds to, if one is deserving, it becomes one's potion of life, and if not. Thus, certainly whoever desires to have compassion on their soul, so as to not forfeit their world, must seek and search intensely for the truth in order to truly return to God. For perhaps one is fooling oneself in some way because one has not been able to form the light properly, because one's vessels are not complete on account of a blemishing in the covenant. The ultimate rectification for this is, let us lift our hearts with our hands to God in heaven. Lamentations 3:41, which is crying out, prayer, and secluded self-expression before God. One must cry out to God profusely with self-surrender until one's soul virtually departs out of yearning. As our sages said, one's prayer is not heard unless one sets one's soul in one's hand. Ta'anit 8a, which they derive from the above verse, cited in Likutey Moharan, Part 2, 99. For the ultimate rectification of the covenant is attained through crying out profusely to God, crying out with at least 70 shouts. And within these 70 shouts are contained countless many cries and shouts and prayers and supplications, for one must pray for this one's entire life. These 70 shouts parallel the 70 faces of the Torah that every Jewish person should attain, and each individual is able to understand in their own soul how distant they still are from even one of the faces of the Holy Torah, certainly from all of them. Thus, even if one has not blemished that greatly, and even if one has already cried out to God profusely and has done many commandments and studied much Torah, nevertheless, since one sees that one has still not attained even 1,000th myriadth of one face of the Torah, how much more must one cry out to God for this one's entire life? Yet, as known, one must never give up on crying out. For even if one has blemished very greatly, and even if one is still stuck wherever one is, if one does not give up on crying out, on prayer and on supplication, one can yet attain the faces of the Torah, even all 70 faces. For God is good to all, and the cow wants to nurse more than the calf wants to suckle. Pesakim 112a. For God desires loving kindness, and seeks to bestow us all good, to shine upon us all of the 70 faces of the Torah, only that we have to make our own initial arousal. The most important thing is to cry out to God profusely until the sum total of one's shouts and cries will reach the category of the 70 shouts, such that one will be able to truly break the evil of the 70 nations who are rooted in the lust, through which one will be able to attain the 70 faces of the Torah. For the 70 faces correspond to 70 years, which are the totality of a human life, corresponding to which are the 70 shouts. That is why one must cry out the 70 shouts throughout one's lifetime, which is embodied in 70 years, which correspond to the 70 faces. Section 20. But all this can only be attained through the power of the authentic tzaddikim, who correspond to Moses' Messiah, through which we are able to endure this enormously bitter and long exile. For the extension of the exile on the physical level is because every individual Jewish person must inevitably enter into exile to be refined and tested in the lusts and traits of the 70 nations, but mostly in the all-encompassing lust. But since most people are unable to properly withstand the temptations, for they do not cry out to God appropriately, the physical exile therefore becomes even more intense. The ultimate rectification comes through the authentic tzaddikim, who have been able to withstand the temptations with absolute wholeness, such that they have attained all of the 70 faces of the Torah to the utmost degree. And they channel the light of the Messiah into each generation, which is the essential work of the great tzaddikim, to channel the light of the Messiah through their holy, novel Torah teachings. For the Spirit of the Messiah hovers upon the faces of the Torah, as written, "The Spirit of God hovered upon the surface of the water." Genesis 1:2. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 118, Part 2, 32. For the ultimate completion of the rectification for all the above will be brought about by the Messiah. May he come speedily in our days, when all questions will be answered and all doubts resolved, when each individual will be able to form the light entirely for a blessing and for the good. Regarding that time is thus said, "I will bestow them one heart and one path to fear me." Jeremiah 32:59. For people will no longer err into the mistaken paths. But even now, during this bitter exile, our entire vitality comes through the great tzaddikim, who shine into us a ray of the light of the Messiah through their authentic novel Torah teachings, through which we are able to attain the true light, to know the ways of innocence followed by our ancestors from the beginning, regarding which is said, "Fortunate are those who follow the path of innocence, who follow God's Torah." Psalms 119:1. Section 21. This is what Rabbi Elazar, son of Azariah, said, "I am as 70 years old and had not been able to establish that the exodus from Egypt should be mentioned at night until Ben Zoma derived it from the verse, Brachot 12b. The exodus from Egypt corresponds to leaving the exile among the 70 nations that are rooted in the all-encompassing lust, which corresponds to the filth of Egypt, which is the lewdness of the earth. For the exile in Egypt was essentially on account of Adam's blemishing in the covenant. That is why all of the exiles are called after the exile in Egypt, Genesis, Rabbah 16:4. For all of the exiles have also been caused by the same thing, as said earlier. But the Israelites, in Moses' great power, were able to leave the exile in this lust, such that they attained the 70 faces of the Torah, which corresponds to their receiving the Torah after leaving Egypt. But though they attained all this, nevertheless, the forces of evil still sought to cause them to stumble, ultimately doing so through the mixed multitude, whose vessels were very blemished, and for whom the light of the Torah had been formed for the opposite of good, who then caused the Israelites to stumble, eventually falling into literal idolatry, making the golden calf. This was because they had overturned the truth and claimed that they were obligated to worship it. For that is the error of all idol worshippers, who call God, God of gods. See above, paragraph 10. The verse thus says regarding the making of the calf, "He formed it by carving," Exodus 32:4. Specifically they formed the light for the opposite of good, all because they had stumbled through the mixed multitude in the blemishing of the covenant, as our sages said. The Israelites only worshipped idolatry in order to break the taboo against public lewdness, Sanhedrin 63b, on account of which sin were caused all of the exiles and troubles, as known. The ultimate rectification in every generation comes through the authentically great tzaddikim who have attained the guarding of the covenant to the utmost degree, and who channel the light of the Messiah, through whom comes the complete rectification, as said earlier. For the essential work of the tzaddikim is to bring the fulfilling of the Torah into the world, which is a rectification that will only be completed by the Messiah. When the verse will be fulfilled, I will make that they will follow my statutes, and I will give them one heart. Ezekiel 36:27. And our entire life and endurance today is through the authentic tzaddikim who channel for us the light of the Messiah through their authentic Torah teachings. That is why we must recall the Exodus from Egypt every day, in order to evoke upon ourselves the holiness of the Exodus from Egypt even today and every day, so that we will even today be able to leave the exile in Egypt and to attain the Torah, which is the fulfilling of the entire Torah. This is what Rabbi Elazar, son of Azariah, said. I am as 70 years old. In his great holiness, he had attained the 70 faces of the Torah already in his youth, through which he became as 70 years old. For the 70 years correspond to the 70 faces of the Torah. But I had not been able to establish that the Exodus from Egypt should be recited at nights. Indeed, the Exodus from Egypt must be recalled and channeled by day and by night. For the night corresponds to sleep and surrender to the light of the infinite, when we must elevate the souls as feminine waters, in order to bring down the light from on high. But when the light descends from on high, its forming for the good takes place mainly during the day, as in, the sun will shine as the light of the morning. 2 Samuel 23. For when we recite the blessing, who forms light and creates darkness, for light corresponds to the world of formation, in which the light is formed for the good. Darkness, however, corresponds to the world of creation, which is higher. For in the higher world, in which is the simple light compared to the world beneath it, the light there is darkness from the perspective of the lower world, as in, he makes darkness his hiding place. Psalms 18:12. For before the light is formed, it is beyond all conception, which is why it is called darkness, on account of the depth of the incomprehensible. From that darkness devolves the darkness of night. For during the nighttime the light of the next day begins to descend, but since it is still unformed, it is darkness. See also Laws of the Blessing over the Torah, number 1, and Laws of Reciting the Shema, number 4. This is why reciting the Shema, prayer, talit, and tefillin, as well as most of the commandments, are only by day, for the forming of the light is only during the day. However, even at night we recite the Shema and pray, specifically the Shema at bedtime before sleep, in order to prepare oneself with appropriate vessels to form the light immediately for blessing as soon as it begins to descend, which is the essence of the Kabbalistic intention of reciting the Shema at bedtime, as obvious to the intelligent. That is why we must recall the Exodus from Egypt also at night. For recalling the Exodus from Egypt is in order to form the light for blessing by recalling and evoking upon ourselves the holiness of the Exodus from Egypt, after which we were privileged to receive the Torah and to form the light for blessing. This is mainly accomplished by day, when the light is formed. But the truth is that even at night we must recall the Exodus from Egypt, because even in the depth of darkness, which corresponds to night, we must endeavor to evoke upon ourselves the holiness of the Exodus from Egypt in order to prepare vessels that will be ready to form the light for blessing when it descends. In fact, the night is the ultimate time of being tested, as in, you tested my heart, you made a reckoning at night. Psalm 17:3 for night corresponds to the darkness of exile, which is before the light of receiving the Torah began to descend, which corresponds to darkness, to exile, which is the main time of being tested. Then, more than all, we must recall the Exodus from Egypt, that just as God did miracles for us during the exile in Egypt and took us out of the defilement of the all-encompassing lust into freedom, into the holiness of receiving the Torah, so will He do for us wonders even now, as in the days of your leaving the land of Egypt will I show you wonders. Micha 7:15. However, the exile is very lengthy, since the forces of evil spread out to all lengths against each and every individual. Rabbi Elazar, son of Azariah, thus said, I am as 70 years old. I have already attained in my youth all of the 70 faces of the Torah, yet I had not been able to establish that the Exodus from Egypt should be recited at nights. Expressing his frustration over the great difficulty in bringing this into the world, recalling the Exodus of Egypt at nights, shining into the heart of every Jewish person to remind themselves of the Exodus from Egypt, even in the great darkness of the nighttime of this long exile, reminding oneself of the great power of the tzaddikim who correspond to Moses, who was able to take us out of the defilement of Egypt, and being that no generation is orphaned, there are certainly great tzaddikim who correspond to Moses in every generation. As our sages said, there is no generation without someone of Moses' stature. Genesis Rabbah 56. 7 for Moses' soul disseminates throughout every generation. Tikkuni, Zohar 69, 1:12. And certainly tzaddikim, as these have the power to take out each and every one of us from exile among the 70 nations, which corresponds to the Exodus from Egypt. But in his humility, Rabbi Elazar, son of Azariah, said that though he had already attained the 70 faces of the Torah, which correspond to 70 years, he had still not been able to bring into the world the recalling and evoking of the Exodus from Egypt until Ben Zoma derived it from a verse, assuming that Ben Zoma was greater than himself, for Ben Zoma had been able to channel this rectification through his holy teachings. The sages as a whole, though, disagreed with Ben Zoma, for the sages as a collective were greater even than Ben Zoma, and they said that though Ben Zoma explained the verse, all the days of your life, as coming to include the nights, it is still difficult to introduce the recalling of the Exodus from Egypt into the nights, which correspond to the extension of the exile. For this requires the dawning of the Messiah, that the great tzaddikim channel through their Torah teachings. This is, but the sages say, the days of your life refers to this world, and all the days of your life refers to the days of the Messiah. For the ultimate rectification will only be completed during the days of the Messiah, when, as in the days of your leaving the land of Egypt, I will show you wonders, which is why even now it is impossible to evoke this rectification other than through the tzaddikim who channel this great light through their Torah teachings. Section 22. This is because the totality of all exiles, especially this final exile, is essentially on account of the intensification of the exile of the bad traits and lusts of the 70 nations, mainly the all-encompassing lust, since we are not making the effort to withstand the temptation and to break them, on account of which the physical exile also intensifies. But just as the Jewish people are in exile, so too is God and the Shekhinah in exile, as in, I am with them in distress. Psalms 91:15. Zohar, Part 3, 298a. So, due to our many sins, in our exile, it is as if God is imprisoned. As written, He is imprisoned in chains. Jeremiah 40:1. Lamentations, Rabbah, Introduction, 34. And, as the spoken about at length in the Tikkuni Zohar, a prisoner cannot release themselves from prison. It is entirely dependent upon repentance to break open his prison. Introduction 9a 6 21 22. For the intensification of the exile is caused by what we have been speaking about, the intensification of the inclination for evil, which is the exile of the soul, which is caused by forming the light from on high, which corresponds to the light of the Torah, for opposite of the truth, on account of which all paths appear wide open to the individual. For one has rendered sins into commandments, especially regarding dispute, see paragraphs 15, 16. That is the ultimate exile of the Shekhinah that each individual causes with their sins, especially in this way. When one is wise in one's own eyes and creates for oneself new commandments that render bloodshed permissible by having formed the light for the opposite of truth, It is as if one would literally seize and imprison the Shekhinah in jail, since one has seized the supernal, simple light by attempting to grasp it with the blemished vessels of one's mind, and has damaged the light by forming it for the opposite of the truth. But due to the great power of free choice that God granted to human beings, God is figuratively forced to allow His holy light to be seized in that person's mind against his will, which is the literal imprisonment of His mighty Shekhinah. As the Rebbe explains on our sage's story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai asking the imprisoned Rabbi Akiva to teach him Torah, that when one teaches an unworthy student, one is punished with imprisonment. Pesachim 112a. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 60. For when one channels God's light below, this corresponds to imprisonment, as in a king imprisoned in the tresses. Song of Songs 7:6. When the light is channeled with holiness, as is God's will, this is very pleasing to God. Whereas when the light of Torah is channeled to an unworthy student, this corresponds to imprisoning the light, which is why the punishment for this is imprisonment. Study all this well in the lesson. This is as said, for when the Torah reaches an unworthy student, that student receives the light of the Torah with the grasping of his blemished vessels and forms them for other than holiness, meaning that he grasps God's light against his will, which literally corresponds to imprisonment. This is all the more true of those argumentative people who damage greatly and overturn the light of truth through the damaged vessels of their minds, forming the light of the Torah for its very opposite, which literally corresponds to the imprisonment of the Shekhinah, which is the ultimate exile of the Shekhinah. But even more so when these opposers and pursuers slander the pursued Jewish person and cause them to literally be sent to prison when the Shekhinah enters into prison with them. For I am with them in distress. Woe to the souls of those who have caused all this. They have only harmed themselves. So when the Jewish person sees that the exile is becoming very intense from all sides, and even more so if one has been pursued and literally sent to jail, one must take to heart to flee from there, specifically to God. For there is certainly no strategy against such troubles, especially against such opposers who pursue one all the way into prison, other than to cry out to God, as written, if imprisoned in chains, He opened their ears to rebuke. Job 36:8, and those who dwell in darkness and the shadow of death, prisoners of affliction. They cried out to God. Psalms 107:10, for one must cry out to God and return to Him in complete repentance. And the ultimate repentance is as said, as in, let us search and assess our ways and return to God. Lamentations 3:40, searching and assessing one's ways meticulously and questioning oneself deeply, why has God done this? It can only be because I have blemished the vessels of my mind and seized onto God's light, dragging it into prison by my forming the light improperly, not as it truly should be. For as already explained, even in the service of God there are many aspects, many ways in which one can err in forming the light of the Torah, veering from the truth many countless different types of errors, subtle and gross, and extremely subtle. Thus, one must constantly search one's own heart, especially in times of distress. That one's having been imprisoned is because one has not formed the light properly and has veered after the foolishness of this world. For there are many things in the world that increase foolishness, so one has been punished in measure with imprisonment. For the supernal, simple light that descends from on high all the time, which sustains human life, although it is one simple light in ultimate oneness, nevertheless, when it descends below and is formed by each individual according to their level, many countless ways and paths diverge and spread out from it, whether into holiness or the opposite. For just as in the realm of holiness itself, there are many ways and paths, so in the realm of evil, there are many convoluted and damaged ways. So every individual must constantly focus on the authentically upright path, turning one's heart to God, so that the light of the Torah will be formed into the path of truth according to one's level. And even along the paths of Torah, one must not fool oneself to veer from the proper path for oneself onto a path that is not proper for oneself, even if it too is a path of the Torah, but is not fitting for one's own level. But all the more should one not veer completely from the authentic paths of Torah. That is why the verse urges, "Weigh the direction of your feet, and all your ways will be established." Proverbs 4:26. And why King David begged profusely, "Teach me, O God, your ways." Paragraph 17. And why our sages said, "Know him in all your ways." Proverbs 3:6. This is a major principle of the Torah. Brachot 63a. For one must indeed bind oneself to God, so that all one's deeds will be for the sake of heaven. Avad 2:12. Hence, every person has many ways open before them, which corresponds to the power of free choice, and from there devolve on the physical level all the different ways that an individual can follow that will lead one to where one wants to go. Thus, when one is punished by being imprisoned and not allowed to go about outside, one must accept deeply that this is because one has blemished in the ways given before them and formed the supernal light according to one's own will, and due to this blemishing, one has been imprisoned such that one is unable to go around as one would like. The only rectification for this is to return to the source and root of all paths, which is the supernal light of God, from which all paths diverge and spread out. One must return to God and bind oneself to the source of oneness, searching and seeking for the path of authentic truth, paving for oneself an upright path of truth, as in your distress. You shall return to your God and obey his voice. Deuteronomy 4:30. And then God's compassion will be restored, and he will bring one out to freedom. For there, in the point of the incipience of the forming of the light at its root, is the world of freedom. For the forming of the light corresponds to understanding, which corresponds to freedom, from where come all freedoms. For it is the root of repentance, which is returning to the holy understanding, reflecting upon one's deeds to return to one's root and to form the light for the good, according to the authentic paths of the Torah that emerge from there. From there come all freedom, as in, do not read carved, but freedom on the tablets. Exodus 32:16 Avot 6:2. Meaning that by carving and forming the Torah properly on the tablets as they were given to Moses on Sinai, one thereby attains freedom. Section 23. Thus, those who dwell in darkness and the shadow of death, prisoners of affliction and iron. Psalms 107. Number 10. This is, because they rebelled against the words of God. They exchanged the words of God by forming the light of the Torah for other than good. Furthermore, they loathed the strategy of the Most High, strategies corresponding to the Torah, which is 613 strategies. Zohar, Part 2, 82b. And they are of the Most High, for they loathe the strategies and the Torah that come from the mouth of the Most High, forming the light for the opposite, as said. On account of this, he humbled their hearts with toil, for a person is led along the path that they desire to follow. So God humbled their hearts until they stumbled without support, for their hearts were confused and distorted, which is, he humbled their hearts with toil. Thus, they stumbled without support, for they had stumbled and veered from the path of truth, such that there was no one who could help them to return to the paths of life. Since it is difficult for them to return and find the upright path of truth after having veered into very evil ways on account of having formed the light for the opposite and veered to an evil path. This is as the Rebbe writes on the verse, I have gone astray, like a lost sheep. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 206. That as soon as a person veers from the upright path, there are very many convoluted paths, all because of the above, because a person is led along the path that they desire to follow. The only way out is they cried out to God in their distress, for crying out always helps, for one must turn away from the darkness and the shadow of death, from one's personal prison, and bind oneself firmly to God alone, to return to the source of oneness, to return and channel the light from there and form it for the good. Only then He will save them from their distress and take them out of darkness. Section 24. However, a boor will not know, and a fool will not understand this. Psalms 92:7, as written, hypocrites become enraged, not crying out when they are imprisoned. Job 36:13, as we find regarding the wicked Balaam, who boasted of knowing the thought of the Most High. Numbers 24:16. Yet when confronted by the angel standing before him in a narrow place in which there was no way to veer to the right or to the left, such that the mare was forced to lie down, he was enraged and beat it, not trying at all to understand God's allusions to him, to turn back from his evil way of seeking to curse the Israelites, and thus uproot himself from two worlds. And after God saw how great his wickedness was, he said to him, "Go with these people." Numbers 22:20. For a person is led along the path that they desire to follow. As Rashi explains there on the verse, for God's ways are upright, the righteous follow them, but the sinner stumble in them. Hosea 14:10. But the more that the upright Jewish people are oppressed, the more that they flee to God, as in Pharaoh brought them close. Exodus 14:10. He brought them close to their Father in heaven. Exodus Rabbah 21:5. Section 25. This is, because you will hear these laws, Deuteronomy 7:12, specifically the heel, when the enemies are so overpowering, such that one is beneath their heel and feet, that they are trampling upon one with their feet, as in, you had people tread on our heads, Psalms 66:12, as in, to crush beneath his feet all prisoners on earth, Lamentations 3:34, and who said to your soul, stoop so that we can go over, and you made your body as the earth, Isaiah 51:23, which corresponds to the heels of the Messiah when the Jewish people are beneath their heels, specifically then, whoever takes to heart to hear these laws, to realize that everything is a decree from on high that has been clothed in the enemies, in order to bring one to repentance, which is, because you will hear these laws, then your God will fulfill for you the covenant and the loving kindness. He will have compassion on us, for God hears the needy and does not scorn his imprisoned ones. Psalms 69:34. This is, Jacob's hands was holding on to Esau's heel, Genesis 25:26, specifically the heel. When Esau will become empowered at the end of the exile during the heels of the Messiah and seek to trample with his heel upon the head of the Jewish people, as in, he set a heel upon me, Psalms 41:10, specifically then, the hand corresponding to faith, to prayer, as in, his hands were faith, which means spread in prayer. Exodus 17:12 holds on to his heel to thereby cast him down and humiliate him, for our power is only with the mouth, to use the craft of our ancestors and cry out to God from wherever we are. This is, who bites the heels of a horse and its rider falls backward. I yearn for your salvation, O God. Genesis 49:17. Samson corresponds to the Messiah, Genesis Rabbah 98:14, which is attained through, I yearn for your salvation. O God, by never despairing of begging for compassion, even when a sharp sword is hanging over one's neck, but constantly yearning for God's salvation and crying out to him no matter what. Through this, even if one is beneath a horse's heels, one will be able to overpower it and cast down one's enemies, as in, who bites the heels of a horse and its rider falls backward. Section 26. Hence, the ultimate damage and greatest blemish, worse than all sins in the Torah, is when one's intelligence has become confused such that the light has been formed for the opposite of the truth, such that one makes a sin into a mitzvah and flames the fires of dispute. This corresponds to our sages' teaching that when a Gentile is forcing a Jew to commit a sin with the intention that he will betray the faith, the Jewish person must allow himself to be killed rather than commit even a minor transgression if it is being witnessed by 10 Jews or during a general decree against Jewish faith. Sanhedrin 74a. Yoreh De'ah 157. This is because when it is in public and the Gentile intends to force the Jew to betray the faith, his entire intention is thus to overturn the truth and form the light for the opposite, for he seeks to have the holy faith betrayed and to have it exchanged with their evil ways. So when this is done in public, which can cause many to be misled from the truth, which is precisely the greatest trap of the forces of evil, one must therefore allow oneself to be killed rather than transgress even a minor commandment in the Torah in order to sanctify the name, so that the forming of the light will not be completely damaged. This itself is the reason why one must allow oneself to be killed rather than transgress any of the 3 cardinal sins, because those sins cause extraordinary damage to the forming of the light. For that very same reason, when the Gentile intends to force the Jew to betray the faith in public before 10 Jews, or during a general decree against Jewish faith, one must allow oneself to be killed rather than transgress. It is all the same thing. Section 27. Thus, when one sees obstacles spreading and intensifying very greatly to obstruct them from the true path, especially through profuse disputes and opposition coming from leaders and commoners, one must know that this is all on account of a blemish in the covenant, regarding which is said, "All those who enter her will not return. They will not reach the paths of life." Proverbs 2:19. That is why they are working to obstruct them from the path of life in many countless ways of enticement, incitation, and smooth talk. And when these inciters and obstructors see that they are unable to achieve their goals of leading them astray from the truth through their evil words, they then rise up against them to obstruct them physically and brazenly, as so common today in our many sins. Then the only way is literally surrendering one's life, telling oneself calmly, "I know the authentic truth, that my intentions are pleasing in heaven, and if my deeds are not properly in line with that, those opposers are not arguing against my deeds that are in fact not fitting and proper, but arguing against my few good deeds, that I am toiling, struggling to pray with devotion, and to bring myself close to people of truth who will lead me along the path of truth, the path followed by our ancestors from the beginning, and they are rising up against me to swallow me unjustly, worse than literal murderers. For causing another to sin is worse than killing them." Tanchuma, Pinchas 3. So, I am obligated to surrender my life because I am a Jew, and every Jewish person, even the worst, will automatically surrender their life for the sanctification of the name. So I too am willing to surrender my life, my body, and my livelihood for the truth, for the sanctification of God's holy name, no matter what I will endure. For the cause of all this is a blemishing in the covenant, for which one must surrender one's soul. So this itself is the essence of my repentance and rectification. For the essence of repentance and rectification for a blemishing in the covenant is surrendering one's life. Understand this. Understand this. For through surrendering one's life, one will certainly break all the obstacles and will certainly attain the paths of life, no matter how much one has blemished in the covenant. For the ultimate rectification is when one withstands the test posed by opposers and obstructors. Study Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 5, and Laws of Tefillin, 4. Section 28. This corresponds to console my people, Isaiah 41. Our ultimate consolation is the Holy Torah and the authentic tzaddikim of each generation. for the ultimate consolation throughout this bitter and long exile is the Holy Torah, as written, "This is my consolation in my distress, for your word sustains me." Psalms 100, 1950. But not everyone is able to receive good strategies from the Torah as one needs at all times. For if one is not deserving, the Torah becomes for them a potion of death. Yoma 72b. That is why everyone needs one who can provide the wheat, which is the authentic tzaddik, who explains and forms for us the light of the Torah for the good, as in, "I have taken a blessing." That is our hope and consolation throughout all types of exiles, collective and personal, physical and spiritual, as in, "This one will console us from outdeeds and our toil." Genesis 5:29. This is the authentic tzaddik who is called this, as in, "This is the entirety of the human being." Ecclesiastes 12:13. For the entire world was only created for him and to be company for him. Brachot 6b. This is console. Console my people, a double consolation. Lamentations Rabbah 1:57. For we need specifically double consolations, which are the consolations of the Torah, as in, "This is my consolation in my distress." But because from the Torah it is not always possible for one to receive and be nourished properly. For one is not deserving, since one might form the light of the Torah for the opposite. Therefore we need another consolation upon the first one, which is the power of the authentic tzaddikim, who explain and form for us the light of the Torah for the good and for blessing, influencing and teaching us to receive good and authentic strategies from the Torah for life and for good, and not for death and for evil, which is the essence of consolation, as in, "This one will console us from outdeeds." This is, "Console, console, my people," says your Elohim. This saying is privately, as the Rebbe says elsewhere, regarding something else. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 21. This corresponds to the simple light that descends from on high before it is formed, which corresponds to something said privately and secretly. For before the manifestation and the forming, it is in the category of silence and secret. Your Elohim corresponds to the forming of the light for the good, for Elohim corresponds to kingship, which corresponds to the evoking and manifesting of godliness and mastership into the lower world, which is the essence of the name Elohim. Thus, Moses, who was the essence of the totality of the Torah, lived for 120 years, Deuteronomy 34:7, paralleling the 120 letter combinations of the name Elohim, which correspond to the interpretations and combinations of the light of the Torah. And similarly, other holy tzaddikim who channeled the Torah into the world lived 120 years, such as Hillel the Prince, Rabbi Yochanan son of Zakkai, and others, Sifri, Zot HaBracha. 16, all paralleling the 120 letter combinations of Elohim, Etz Chaim, 15:6, so that they would explain and combine for us the letters of the Torah for the good, which is our ultimate consolation, as said. Hence, console, console my people, says your Elohim. The verse thus continues, "Speak to the heart of Jerusalem," specifically the heart, for the ultimate forming of the light is in the heart, which corresponds to understanding, in which the light is formed, which corresponds to the vowel form, for the heart is the chariot of understanding, where the name Hashem is voweled with form. This corresponds to, "You shall restore to your heart," Deuteronomy 4:39, 4. The light of intelligence, which is the light of the Torah, must be brought into the heart to form it for the good, which is the most important thing. This is why the verse continues, "A voice is calling out in the wilderness, clear the way of God, straighten a road to our God in the plain." Isaiah 43:2. For by forming the light for the good through the authentic tzaddikim, straight paths to God are opened, even in places that had been desolate wilderness, and all the damaged, crooked, and mountainous paths which were all caused by those who turned the straight paths and transformed the truth, such that the straight ways were damaged and became desolate wilderness. Damaged and convoluted paths are now, through the authentic tzaddikim who form the light for the good, all rectified for God, as in, a voice calls out in the wilderness, "Clear the way of God." All this is brought about through the shining of the light of the Messiah that is channeled in every generation, through which we are able to endure during the exile, and ultimately, I will grant them one heart and one path to fear me all the days. Jeremiah 32:39. Swiftly in our days. Amen. This corresponds to, "Fortunate is the one whose might is in you, in whose hearts are pathways." Psalms 84:6. Very great might, fortitude, and self-encouragement are necessary in this world during the few years of one's earthly life to be able to stand up against all feelings of rejection that the forces of evil place in one's way all the time, but mainly through one's false ideas by having formed the light for the opposite. This corresponds to, "Let us search and assess our ways," and Lamentations 3:40. We must constantly search and assess and seek a strategy and pathway how to take leave of one's foolishness and to come close to God, and at least to not fall even further on account of the feelings of rejection that are clothed in commandments that claim, "You know your immense grossness and your many blemishes. So why are you still toiling and hoping to come close to God?" All this and the likes come from the shell and the realm of evil, but mainly from the shell of Balaam, who seeks to form the light of the Torah for the opposite of the truth, whose main power comes from his great spiritual filth that he channels, which is the sexual lust that comes through him and spreads out in all directions with such lusts and fantasies of all sorts. And if that were not enough, he also seeks, through the forming of the light, for the opposite, to cast a person down completely to the bottom of hell, as many have already fallen on account of such ideas. For which reason, we need enormous might and self-encouragement against him. This is, "Fortunate is the one whose might is in you, in whose hearts are pathways," the acronym of which is Balaam. For to counter the shell of Balaam, we need enormous might and self-encouragement, as said. Laws of Wine Vessels. Law 1. Based on the lesson in Likutey Moharan, Part 2, 4. Study there the entire lesson from beginning to end. In sum, fear of God is attained through desire, by knowing that everything is conducted solely upon God's desire and will, and that there is no inevitability of nature at all. Desire is manifested through the three festivals, as in calling out of holiness, Leviticus 23:4. For a holy festival calls out and manifests desire. However, there are evil beasts, who are the natural scientists, who fight against the manifestation of desire, and they are subdued by the authentic sages of the generation, who bind all desires to the root of desire, which corresponds to the forehead of desire, which corresponds to the desire of desires, which corresponds to the departing of Moses on Shabbat afternoon. Countering this is the forehead of the serpent, which is the root of natural wisdom and which is nourished mainly by the elders of the generation who lack wholeness. The older one gets, with every new day of one's life, one must increase one's holiness and intelligence, as in, God called the light day, Genesis 1:5. For every new day must shine more greatly than the previous one. But these elders of the generation did not shine on each new day with greater holiness, and thus lack wholeness. So from their fallen days is the forehead of the serpent nourished. And the forehead of the serpent is subdued through charity. For through charity we elevate and rectify the blemish of the fallen days of those elders who lack wholeness, as in, cast your bread upon the surface of the waters, for after many days you will find it. Ecclesiastes 11:1. We then subdue the forehead of the serpent, the root of natural wisdom, thereby subduing the natural scientists, and then the voice of the call of the festival that calls out and manifests. Desire is manifested and heard, and through the manifestation of desire, fear of God is brought about, as in, He makes the desire of those who fear Him. Psalms 145:19. Then through the fear, an engraving and channel is made in which to receive the loving kindness, as in an engraver from between his legs. Genesis 49:10. And through the bestowal of loving kindness, we don't have to do anything for our sustenance, for the world is sustained through loving kindness, as in, foreigners will rise up and shepherd your flocks, and the sons of foreigners will be your farmers and your vine dressers, while you will be called God's priests. Isaiah 61:5. Study all this there very well. Section 1. This corresponds to the prohibition of libated wine and wine vessels belonging to a Gentile. Wine corresponds to judgments, Shar HaHakdamat 83, which corresponds to fear, as in, do not look at wine that it is red, Proverbs 23:31, that will turn to blood, Sanhedrin 70a, and blood corresponds to judgments, which corresponds to fear, and also, as written, the mighty ones drink wine, Isaiah 4:22. That is why wine has two aspects. There is wine that gladdens, as in, wine gladdens the heart, Psalms 104:15. And there is intoxicating wine, and the difference is in the vessel that contains the wine, as we see for ourselves on the physical level. One person is able to drink wine, and it gladdens his heart, whereas another person is unable to drink wine, and it will intoxicate him and confuse his mind, because he lacks the vessel that is able to contain it. Similarly, on the spiritual plane, the holiness of wine is dependent upon the vessels that contain it, for wine corresponds to fear, to judgments, and if one's heart is completely with God, with firm faith that everything is according to God's will, then one will always be happy and will have no concern or fear at all from anything in the world, as in, you will not fear sudden fear, Proverbs 3:25. For since everything is according to God's will, there is therefore no reason to fear anything. For who can do anything, major or minor, without God's will? As written, God is with me, I shall not fear. Psalms 118:6. Thus, one will always be happy, and even if sometimes one will endure some pain, nevertheless, since one knows that everything is entirely according to God's will, one is always able to bring joy to oneself. For God's intention in bringing some pain is certainly for the good, whether to remind one to repent or to atone for one's sins. Thus, all suffering is great good, and one is thereby able to bring joy to oneself at all times. For one knows that God is filled with compassion, and His intention is certainly for the good, and that the suffering will not last forever. For God will certainly have compassion and bring benefit to one's ultimate end, and the suffering will be transformed into great good forever and ever. So one can always be happy. However, one who veers away from faith and errs into the denials of the natural scientists, believing that nature is independent and inherent, has no life at all. For all of one's days will be irritation and pains, and the wicked one worries all the days of his life in peace. A marauder will befall him, Job 15:20, fearing that a sudden tragedy will come upon him, and when distress or suffering does befall him, he has no one to turn to for salvation. He is thus constantly filled with pain and suffering and fears and sadness, and has no life at all, as explained in the Rebbe's holy discussions, Sichot Haran 32:53, 102. Study there. Hence, whoever possesses full faith in desire, that everything is according to God's will, is able to attain great joy through the fear that is brought about by the manifestation of desire, as in, rejoice with trembling. Psalms 2:11. For all fears and apprehensions that one has from anything in the world, are all transformed into great joy, for through that one returns to God and knows that everything is for the good. And as explained in the lesson, this corresponds to the joy of the festival through the manifestation of desire, as in, a righteous one will rejoice upon witnessing vengeance. And people will say, there is indeed reward for the righteous. There, 58, 11-12. But the wicked one who veers after natural sciences corresponds to short of days and filled with rage, Job 14:1. As explained in the lesson, for he is literally filled with rage, since all his days are irritation and pains, for he totally lacks life and joy. Section 2. This corresponds to wine that gladdens and wine that intoxicates. It is all dependent upon full faith, having faith that everything is upon God's will. When wine, which is in the category of judgments, corresponding to fear, is wine that gladdens. For when one has full faith that everything is upon God's will, one attains great joy through the fear, for one knows that God's intention is certainly for the good. This corresponds to fear of God increases days, Proverbs 10:27, for fear increases one's days and length of life, since the two are interdependent. In other words, through the manifestation of desire that is channeled from the elders of holiness, fear is brought about, and the other way around, the manifestation of desire comes through fear. When fear comes upon a person through the manifestation of desire, then one knows that everything is God's will, and then one fears him. As in, Jacob feared and was distressed, Genesis 32:8, and through that fear of God, one returns to him in complete repentance, and the closer one comes to him, the more that desire is manifested to the individual. This corresponds to fear of God increases days, which corresponds to the elder of holiness, which corresponds to length of days, in that one's days are constantly lengthened with increasing holiness, through which desire is manifested, as explained in the lesson, and one thereby attains joy, for through the manifestation of desire comes joy, which corresponds to the joy of the festival. Hence, holy fear, even only fear of punishment, corresponds to joy, for even fear of punishment is also very beneficial, as the Rebbe explains elsewhere, Sichot Haran 5. Since one has faith that everything is upon God's will, and one has fear of him, that he not punish one for one's evil deeds, this fear is very beneficial, for through it one returns to God, and at least, no matter what, the suffering and punishments will atone for one's sins. But even if one is unable to return in full repentance through the suffering, at least one will certainly have many thoughts of repentance on account of the fear of suffering, and no matter what, great benefit will certainly come to one through the suffering and fear. Thus, even through fear of punishment, one can attain great joy, since one knows that everything is upon God's will. This corresponds to wine that gladdens, for wine corresponds to fear and judgments through which one attains joy by having attained full faith. But when a Gentile touches the wine, it immediately becomes libated wine and becomes forbidden to a Jewish person. This is because wine touched by a Gentile corresponds to a Gentile, corresponding to denials, and natural scientists touching the wine, the fears and apprehensions, and then wine, which corresponds to fear, is immediately blemished, for their touch alone causes blemish, since their thoughts can be assumed to be idolatrous. And even today, when they do not worship literal idolatry, nevertheless they are filled with denials of the natural scientists to whom they are very attached. And all the denials are in the category of idolatry, as the Rebbe writes elsewhere, Likutey Halakhot, Part 2, 1. They blemish fear and apprehensions, which correspond to wine, for they do not attribute everything to God's desire, but only to nature. And then wine, which corresponds to fear, becomes wine that intoxicates, for it literally intoxicates, alluding to all the distress and pains, as written, intoxicated, but not from wine, Isaiah 51:21. For fear and distress then increase. As in, the wicked one worries all the days of his life. Job 15:20. For when one does not believe in desire, one is constantly filled with great fear and apprehension, and all one's days are irritation and pains. One has no life at all, for one has no one to turn to when distress befalls, and no consolation or delight to ameliorate one's pain and worries, as the Rebbe explains. Thus, wine, which corresponds to fear, will not gladden them at all, but on the contrary, will intoxicate and confuse them, which is the ultimate intoxication and confusion of mind, which is when one's mind is confused and one attributes everything to nature. That is why wine, which corresponds to fear, is blemished by the touch of a Gentile, for it becomes libated wine, corresponding to idolatry, to denials. For their thoughts can be assumed to be idolatrous, that is, the denials of the natural scientists, on account of which the wine, which corresponds to fear, is blemished and becomes intoxicating wine. Section 3. Our sages thus said that Joseph sent aged wine to Jacob, for the mind of the elders is calmed by it. Megillah 16b. Specifically, the mind of elders. For the only ones who can drink wine with holiness are elders of holiness, through whom comes the manifestation of desire, as said, through which fear is brought about, which corresponds to wine that gladdens when wine is with holiness, as said. Section 4. Now, Shabbat and the festivals are the main time for the manifestation of desire, as explained in the lesson, for the manifestation is mainly on the festivals, and the manifestation itself comes from the forehead of desire, the desire of desires, which is manifested on Shabbat afternoon, Zohar, Part 2, 88b. For the festivals receive from Shabbat, as explained elsewhere, Laws of Shabbat, 2, Laws of the Intermediate Days, 3. So, the main manifestation of desire is on Shabbat and the festivals. Therefore, Shabbat and the festivals is the main time for drinking wine with holiness, wine that gladdens, for they are days of joy, for they are the time when desire is manifested through which fear is manifested, which corresponds to wine that gladdens. Section 5. This corresponds to wine vessels. Wine must not be kept in Gentile vessels. This is because the essence of the holiness of wine is dependent upon its being contained in an appropriate vessel, which is why the drinking of wine with holiness is only from a chalice of blessing, specifically a chalice of blessing, rather than wine of blessing, stressing that it is dependent upon the vessel, calling it a chalice of blessing. For the holiness of wine is dependent upon the holiness of the vessel. That is why our sages called it a chalice of blessing, Brachot 51a, stressing the vessel. For it is all dependent upon the vessel that contains the wine which corresponds to fear. For the vessel is numerically Elohim, Zohar, Part 3, 245a, and Elohim is numerically nature, Pardes, Rimonim, 12, 2. For that is the ultimate holiness. When one knows that there is no nature at all, but that nature itself is from God, who sometimes conducts the world in seemingly natural ways in order to test people so that there will be free choice in the world, and in order to show that nature is in his hand. That is why he occasionally changes nature, as we have witnessed from his awesome signs and wonders that took place on the festivals, which are a commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt. While the truth is that nature itself is also his providence, for everything is entirely from him, since nature is numerically Elohim, because nature itself is from the living God and King of the world. This corresponds to the chalice of blessing, when the wine is with holiness as wine that gladdens, which is dependent upon the vessel that contains the wine being complete. And this completeness of the vessels is attained through faith. This is because the chalice of blessing always comes to a place where there is a manifestation of desire, such as on Shabbat and the festivals. When we recite the Kiddush over wine and manifest the holiness of Shabbat and festivals, which is the manifestation of desire, specifically over a chalice of wine. For the essence of the holiness of Shabbat and festivals, which is the manifestation of desire, is attained through the Kiddush over wine, when desire is manifested, as in a calling out of holiness, a commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt, which we recite in the Kiddush over the chalice. Section 6. This corresponds to the chalice used for the blessing after meals, as in, "You shall eat, be satiated, and bless your God for the good land." Deuteronomy 8:10. Hence, the essence of the blessing after meals is to bless God for the land of Israel that He gave us, and the essence of the holiness of the land of Israel is attained through the manifestation of desire. As the Rebbe explains several times, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 44, Part 2, 8, 78. And as our sages said, that the Torah began with the story of creation to teach us that He had given the nations the land because that was what He initially desired, and He took it away from them and gave it to us when He desired that. Genesis, Rabbah 1:2. Hence, the essence of the holiness of the land of Israel is attained through the manifestation that everything is through God's desire. That is why all of the 10 levels of holiness are in the land of Israel. Kalim, chapter 1. For the ultimate holiness is when it is manifested that everything comes through God's desire, and the temple, which is the holiest of all, is also where desire is most greatly manifested, which is why it is to the temple that we bring all sacrificial offerings, regarding which is said, "For desire." Leviticus 19:5. This corresponds to, "For your servants desire its stones," and Psalms 102:15. For the stones themselves are a manifestation of desire, while the foundation stone, in the Holy of Holies, corresponds to the root of desire, the desire of desires, which is why no one is allowed to enter there other than the high priest on Yom Kippur. This is because the high priest attains the forehead of desire, as in, it will be on his forehead for desire. Exodus 28:38. As stated in the lesson, paragraph 7, which corresponds to the desire of desires. That is why we are obligated to be seen before God on each of the 3 festivals, as written 3 times a year. God's countenance. Deuteronomy 16:16. God's countenance corresponding to desire, which corresponds to the countenance, as stated in the lesson, paragraph 8, which is a requirement specifically on the festivals, which is the time of the manifestation of desire. So we must come to be seen at this time in the temple, which is the site of the manifestation of desire. Section 7. This is because the chalice of blessing corresponds to charity, which is the main way through which desire is manifested, as in, "A good-eyed one will bless, for he gave from his bread to the needy," Proverbs 22:9, which refers to the chalice of blessing, Sotah 38b. Indeed, wherever a chalice of blessing is used, one must be all the more a good-eyed one, to give of one's bread to the needy, which is charity. On Shabbat and festivals, we bring a chalice of wine for the Kiddush in order to evoke the holiness of Shabbat and festivals through the chalice of wine, and we must give profuse charity for Shabbat and festivals. Shabbat is the time of the ultimate illumination and wholeness of all charity, as in, charity for the poor is like the sun on Shabbat. Ta'anit 8b, as the Rebbe explains elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 31. And for the festival, we must certainly give profuse charity, as written, "You shall rejoice before your God, you, your son, the proselyte, the orphan, and the widow." Deuteronomy 16:11. Upon which our sages comment, "If you gladden what is mine, I will gladden what is yours." Midrash Tanchuma, Reh 18. In fact, the essence of the joy of the festivals comes through the manifestation of desire, which is manifested specifically through charity, as said and as explained in the lesson, paragraph 9, as in, "Cast your bread upon the surface of the waters, for after many days you will find it. Ecclesiastes 11:1. This is why the next verse there says, "Grant a portion to 7 as well as to 8, which our sages explain as referring to the festivals, Eruvin 40b, which is, as said, for the essence of the holiness of the festivals, which is the joy of the festivals, is attained through charity, as in, cast your bread." Hence, the chalice of blessing is used for the Kiddush on Shabbat and festivals in order to thereby evoke the holiness and joy of the festivals, so that one will be in the category of being a good-eyed one. For it is the time of charity and benevolence through which the holiness of the festival is evoked. The Jewish people indeed are accustomed to give profusely to charity for the festivals, sending benevolently to the poor, for it is impossible to receive the holiness and joy of the festival other than through charity, through which one attains the manifestation of desire, which is the essence of the holiness and joy of the festival. The same with the blessing after meals. When we bring a chalice of blessing to the table, and from each meal we are obligated to give a portion to the poor. Zohar, Part 2, 168b, which is the ultimate wholeness of the chalice of blessing, which should only be given to a good-eyed one, as in, a good-eyed one will bless, for he has given of his bread to the needy. For the most important thing is charity, through which desire is manifested. And then the chalice is filled with God's blessing, for the wine is, then, with holiness, for through the desire is holy fear brought about, which corresponds to joy, to wine that gladdens, as said. Thus, we must guard the wine from Gentile vessels, for the wine is blemished by wine vessels belonging to Gentiles, who are errant and lost in the natural sciences, on account of which their fear is blemished. That is the essence of bad fear is a bad strap. Zohar, Part 1, 11b. For whoever attains faith that everything is upon God's will, then even fear of punishment is beneficial. Furthermore, we specifically need fear of punishment and cannot come close to God other than through fear of punishment, as the Rebbe writes, Sichot Haran 5. But when one errs into natural sciences, then all of one's fears are bad fears, which are completely harsh judgments, corresponding to intoxicating wine. For this judgment cannot be ameliorated, for there is no consolation for one's pain and fear and apprehension, as said. That is why wine, which corresponds to fear and judgments, is blemished when it is poured into Gentile vessels, for as soon as it enters their vessels, which are blemished on account of natural sciences, the wine become intoxicating wine, corresponding to harsh and complete judgments. Then, when one then drinks this wine that has become forbidden by the Gentile vessels, it is as if one has worshipped idols, for the denials of natural sciences intensify greatly. Since that is the source of their wine, which itself is the main cause of the confusion of mind when faith has become blemished by natural sciences, which corresponds to intoxicating wine. That is why all punishments are called veiled wine, Psalm 65, as Rashi explains there. For it seals and dulls the heart, for that itself is their punishment for veering away from the holy faith and following natural sciences. That is why God will bring upon them harsh punishment through veiled wine, which seals the heart, for their minds will become confused by their punishment and fears, for they have no one to turn to, and no consolation, as said and as written. They will look around the earth, but it is dark. Isaiah 5:30. This corresponds to, for there is a chalice in God's hand, filled with intoxicating wine, and all the wicked on earth will suck, drink to its dregs. Psalm 75:9. The ultimate punishment corresponds to intoxicating wine, which corresponds to veiled wine, which is brought about mainly through the blemish of natural sciences. For as long as one knows that everything is from God, there is no pain or suffering in the world at all, and everything is good, as the Rebbe explains in several places. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 65, 250. That is why the reward of the tzaddikim who had faith in God at all times is called wine preserved in its grapes since the 6 days of creation. Brachot 34b. For that itself is the essence of the reward, when God's desire will be manifested in the world, and all will see that all the troubles that we suffered during the exile were all for our good. Those tzaddikim who had faith even in their exile, distress, and suffering, that everything is for the good upon God's will, and thereby came close to Him, that corresponds to wine that gladdens, for they came close to God through all those fears and judgments, and thereby attained joy, through which they will receive measure for measure in the future, on a day that is entirely good, the wine that is preserved in its grapes. That time will be our ultimate joy, when wine will be wine that gladdens, for then it will be manifested that everything was for our good, as in entirely good, entirely one, which corresponds to wine that gladdens, as in my chalice is overflowing. Psalms 23:5. This is because the essence of the reward in the future will be that we will be able to merge into God's will, which corresponds to the departing of Moses at the time of desire of desires, which corresponds to wine that gladdens, to the preserved wine that is evoked by the manifestation of desire. So whoever had full faith in this world, faith that everything is according to God's will attain this in the future, the wine that gladdens, the wine preserved in its grapes, which is to merge into God's desire, into the desire of desires. Fortunate is the one who will attain this. That is why it is called wine that is preserved in its grapes since the 6 days of creation. For the essence of the holiness of the wine is when we have faith that God created everything during the 6 days of creation, and that everything is conducted according to His will, which is the essence of the holiness of wine, corresponding to wine that gladdens, which corresponds to the preserved wine. Section 8. This corresponds to Hanukkah. The wicked kingdom of Greece attacked the Jewish people to cause them to forget the Torah. For the kingdom of Greece corresponds to the natural scientists who deny the entire Torah, and the errant wisdom of the natural scientists is actually called Greek wisdom by our sages, Sota 49b, Midrash Tehillim, chapter 1. When they discussed whether one may teach one's son Greek wisdom, which refers to the natural sciences. Thus, when the wicked Greeks attacked the Jewish people, it was a time of very great distress, for it was a time when natural scientists who deny God's desire were empowered. For this reason, when the Hasmoneans were able to vanquish them, a miracle took place related to the oil, and it was instituted for posterity to kindle an oil candle on Hanukkah. Oil corresponds to desire. As written, may he be desired by his brothers and immerse his foot in oil, Deuteronomy 33:24, as Rashi explains on the verse. The burden will be broken before oil, Isaiah 10:27, before Hezekiah, who was pleasant toward his generation as oil, for oil is connected with desire and satisfaction. This is because the ultimate desire comes through the forehead of desire, which corresponds to, it will be on his forehead for desire. Exodus 28:38, which refers to the high priest, which corresponds to oil, as in, as good oil on the head descending upon the beard of Aaron. Psalms 133:2. The manifestation of desire, corresponding to the forehead of desire, corresponds to the holy beard, as explained in the lesson, which corresponds to Aaron's beard. For Aaron was a high priest who attained the forehead of desire, which corresponds to the beard, to desire of desires. For the forehead of desire and the beard are one and the same concept, the desire of desires, as brought in the Kabbalistic writings. Thus, on Hanukkah, when we must subdue the natural sciences, Greek wisdom, we must evoke this oil that corresponds to the holy anointing oil, to the manifestation of desire, through which we kindle the Chanukah candles. And the kindling of this candle corresponds to the manifestation of fear, which corresponds to a consuming fire, as in, your God is a consuming fire. Deuteronomy 4:24. A great and awesome God. There, 7:21. For fear corresponds to fire, since through desire, which corresponds to oil, we kindle the candle that corresponds to fear. For fear is brought about through desire, as said, and through fear we are able to receive the loving kindness, which is the priest, as in, you shall be called God's priests, Isaiah 61:6. This is why the miracle took place through the priests. And that is why we give profuse charity on Hanukkah, for the ultimate manifestation of desire corresponds to oil to subdue the natural sciences that correspond to the wicked kingdom of Greece through charity, as in, cast your bread. This corresponds to the juxtaposition of the oil for the meal offerings and the wine for libations, Numbers 16:4-5. The essence of the holiness of wine, which corresponds to fear, is when it is wine that gladdens, which is attained through oil, which corresponds to desire. This is wine to gladden the human heart, oil to shine the face, Psalms 104:15. For by shining the face with oil, which corresponds to desire, which corresponds to showing favor, wine gladdens the heart. For specifically, through that is the wine, a wine that gladdens, as said. Study in Laws of Chanukah, included in Laws of a Paid Guardian, 2, where this issue is also discussed. For most of this, lesson alludes to the mitzvah of Chanukah. Study also in the Kabbalistic intentions of Hanukkah in the Pri-Etz Chaim, that during the 8 days of Hanukkah, we evoke an illumination of the 10 rectifications of the beard, which corresponds to the beard discussed earlier. Study there. Section 9. This corresponds to the mitzvah of circumcision. The foreskin that covers the covenant corresponds to the clouds that cover the eyes, which correspond to the foreign ideas of the natural scientists who cover the intelligence, confusing and sealing the intelligence and the heart with their foreign ideas. That is why we must cut off the foreskin that covers the covenant in order to subdue the filth of the serpent, as in a shield of copper or copper alloy on his legs, 1 Samuel 17:6, specifically on his legs, for its main grip is through a blemish in the covenant, which corresponds to legs. So, when we cut off the foreskin, the crown is uncovered, which corresponds to faith, to the manifestation of desire, which corresponds to a holy elder. For one becomes a holy elder through the rectification of the covenant, as in, you shall glorify the face of an elder, Leviticus 19:32, for a eunuch has no elder beard. As explained elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 27, Likutey Torah Ari, section on Ikev. This is because the wholeness of faith is attained through the rectification of the covenant, as explained elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 31, and then, through the manifestation of desire, holy fear is brought about, which is also dependent upon the rectification of the covenant, as brought elsewhere, as in the beginning covenant of fire, fear, embarrassment, Tikkuni Zohar, 28, paragraph 72b, which is why, regarding Joseph the Tzaddik, who guarded the covenant, is said, I fear God, Genesis 42:18. And this is why circumcision is a mitzvah that the Jewish people accepted upon themselves with joy, Shabbat 130a. For through the manifestation of desire and of fear, we thereby attain great joy. Which is why the rectification of the covenant is called might and delight. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 27. Might corresponds to holy fear, which corresponds to joy and delight. Thus, even after cutting off the foreskin, as long as the membrane has not been split and the crown has not been uncovered, it is as if no circumcision had been done. Shabbat 137b, which corresponds to what is stated in the lesson that even after we have subdued, broken, and eliminated the natural sciences, nevertheless, as long as the manifestation of desire is not strong, the forces of evil can still resurge, which corresponds to, he reinstated the stone. Study there well in the lesson. This corresponds to the splitting of the membrane, even after the cutting off of the foreskin, which is the filth of the serpent that covers the covenant, corresponding to natural sciences that cover intelligence. Nevertheless, as long as the holy crown, which corresponds to the rectification of the covenant, to the manifestation of desire, has not yet been uncovered, the forces of evil are still attached and are still able to overpower, even though they have already been subdued and the foreskin has already been completely removed. For this reason, we must then make sure to split the membrane and uncover the crown, which is to manifest the desire, so that very strong, firm, and great desire will be manifested, so that all will know that the world is conducted solely upon God's desire. Only then is there ultimate subdual, which corresponds to the uncovering of the crown by the splitting of the membrane. Section 10. This corresponds to the chalice of wine used during the circumcision ritual. Through the manifestation of desire and fear, the wine is then wine that gladdens circumcise, and wine are both numerically 70, which corresponds to desire that is channeled by the elder of holiness. And elderliness and old age correspond to 70 years, which correspond to the 70 faces of the Torah, paralleling the 70 nations that correspond to the natural scientists. That is why through circumcision, which corresponds to the rectification of the covenant, we thereby attain elderliness, which corresponds to desire, and then the wine is with holiness. For the rectification of wine with holiness is attained through the guarding of the covenant, through which desire is manifested. Our sages thus said, "Whoever witnesses an accused adulteress in her disgrace should vow abstention from wine." Nazir 2a. And why after the circumcision, which is the rectification of the covenant, corresponding to the manifestation of desire to the elder of holiness, we then bring out a chalice of wine, for wine is then with holiness, as in wine that gladdens. Laws of Wine Vessels 2. In Laws of Libated Wine 3. Paragraph 8. Laws of Wine Vessels 3. In Laws of Libated Wine 4. Paragraph 11.